The morning light came in slowly through the tall windows of a townhouse on Fifth Avenue, the kind of light that touched everything before anyone was awake to notice it. The marble floor in the entry hall held the chill of the night before. A maid moved through the lower rooms with a careful, practiced silence, lifting the linen covers from chairs that no one would sit in for hours, opening the heavy velvet drapes one window at a time, letting the grey New York morning enter the house the way a guest might enter a sick room, on tiptoe and without speaking. Somewhere far above, on the third floor, in a bedroom larger than most apartments, a young woman lay still beneath an embroidered counterpane and did not yet know that her mother had hired 3 men in plain coats to follow her wherever she went that day. She would not know it for years. By the time she found out, the world she'd been born into would already be gone. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly through one of the strangest, most quietly devastating corners of the Gilded Age. We're going to sit inside the houses of women whose lives looked, from the outside, like the polished ending of a fairy tale. They had everything. They had everything that money and lineage and Fifth Avenue and Newport and the social register could give them, and some of them, in the privacy of their drawing rooms, lifted the telephone or wrote a letter on heavy cream paper and hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, or the William J. Burns Agency, or any of the smaller men who advertised in the back pages of certain newspapers, and asked those men to follow their own husbands, their own sons, their own daughters, their own brothers. They paid in cash, they paid in installments, they paid by discreet wire transfer, and the men in plain coats fanned out across Manhattan and Newport and Tuxedo Park and Bar Harbor, and they wrote down everything they saw, and the reports came back, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily, in plain envelopes that were burned in the fireplace after they had been read. This is the story of those women and the men they hired and the things they wanted to know. It is a story about marble staircases and gas lamps and the smell of beeswax polish on dark wood, about ballrooms lit with electric chandeliers when electric chandeliers were still a kind of miracle, about long afternoons in summer cottages that were not cottages at all but 70-room palaces by the sea. It is a story about agency, which is a strange word to use for women who lived inside walls they did not build, but it is the right word because what they did was extraordinary, and it has been almost entirely forgotten. The house was called number 645th Avenue, and it stood on the east side of the avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets, behind a wrought iron fence and a small dry fountain and a row of clipped boxwoods that the gardener watered before dawn so that no one would see him do it. The house had 4 stories and an attic, and a service wing that ran back along the side street, and inside it lived a woman we will call Adelaide, though her real name is in the records under a different spelling. Adelaide was 47 years old in the autumn of 1893. She had inherited a portion of a railroad fortune from her father, and she had married a man who owned coal mines in Pennsylvania, and the combined household income in the years before income tax existed was something her own accountants did not bother to total, because there was no reason to. The money simply arrived and was deposited and was managed by men in offices downtown who sent her quarterly summaries written in a careful copperplate hand. Adelaide rose at 7:30 every morning, which was considered slothful by the standards of her grandmother, but appropriate to her station. Her lady's maid, a French woman named Yvette, who had been with her for 19 years, drew the bath and laid out the morning dress, which was always wool in the cooler months and lawn cotton in the warmer ones, always trimmed at the cuffs and collar with the particular kind of lace that her grandmother had favoured. Adelaide did not choose her clothes. She had not chosen her clothes in 20 years. The clothes were chosen for her by Yvette, who understood the rhythm of the social calendar better than Adelaide did, and who knew which morning called for which dress, and who arranged everything on the chaise longue in the dressing room before Adelaide had even opened her eyes. The breakfast room faced east, which meant that on bright mornings the sunlight came in through the tall windows and lay across the white linen tablecloth in long, warm rectangles. There was always coffee, which the kitchen had been preparing since 6 o'clock, and there was always toast made from bread baked the night before, and there was always a small dish of stewed fruit, and on Wednesdays there was a poached egg, and on Sundays there was a kipper. The footman, a young man from County Cork named Sean, stood by the sideboard with his hands behind his back and waited to be summoned. He was never summoned. Adelaide had eaten breakfast in the same room with the same view and the same routine for almost 2 decades, and the footman's presence was simply part of the architecture of the room, like the wallpaper or the brass fender around the fireplace. It was during this breakfast, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1893, that Adelaide read the letter that would change everything. The letter had been delivered the previous evening by a private messenger and placed on the silver salver in the front hall, where the butler had inspected the handwriting and concluded that it required no immediate attention and could wait until morning. It was from her older sister, who lived in Boston, and it was 4 pages long, and it concerned a matter so delicate that the sister had felt unable to write it directly. The letter circled the subject for 2 pages, discussing the weather and the health of various cousins and the recent improvements to the gardens at the Boston Public Garden before finally arriving on the 3rd page at what it had come to say. The sister wrote that she'd been told by a woman whose name she did not wish to put in writing, but whom Adelaide would know if she were told, that Adelaide's husband had been seen on 3 separate occasions in the company of a young woman at a small hotel on 23rd Street. The woman was not a member of any society Adelaide would recognise. The hotel was respectable, but not fashionable. The visits had taken place on consecutive Thursday afternoons. The sister apologised for putting this in writing. She suggested that Adelaide might wish to make inquiries. Adelaide read the letter twice. She refolded it carefully along its original creases. She placed it in the pocket of her dressing gown. She finished her coffee. She thanked the footman, which she did not usually do, and she walked slowly up the broad staircase to the 2nd floor, and she went into the small writing room that overlooked the back garden, and she sat down at the desk, and she did not move for a very long time. What she felt during those minutes we cannot know. There is no diary entry that survives from that morning. There is no letter she wrote describing it. We know what happened afterward, because the records of what happened afterward survive in the archived files of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, where they sat for nearly a century before being transferred to the Library of Congress, and where any patient researcher can read them now. But we do not know what she thought, alone in that writing room, with the grey October light coming in through the window, looking out over a garden that her husband had paid to have landscaped, in a house that her husband's coal money had partially paid to maintain, with a letter from her sister in the pocket of her dressing gown. What we know is that she rose eventually and walked to the desk and took out a sheet of plain stationery. The stationery was plain because she did not want her monogram on the letter she was about to write. She wrote in her own hand, without dictating to a secretary, and she addressed the letter to the New York office of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and she asked, in language that was careful and dignified and almost businesslike, for a representative to call upon her at her home on a matter of personal concern. She specified that the representative should come on Thursday, in the late morning, when her husband would be at his office downtown. She specified that he should arrive in plain dress and not in any uniform or insignia. She signed the letter with her initials only. She sealed it with wax. She rang for the footman, and she handed him the letter, and she instructed him to take it to the post office personally and to mention it to no one. The man who arrived on Thursday morning was named, in the records, only as Agent M. He was in his middle 40s. He wore a dark grey suit and a soft hat and carried a leather portfolio. He was admitted to the small reception room on the ground floor, and he was given coffee, and Adelaide came down to meet him, and they sat for approximately 50 minutes, and Agent M did almost all of the listening. When he left, he had a retainer of $200 in his pocket and a clear set of instructions. He was to follow the husband. He was to identify the woman. He was to determine the frequency and nature of the meetings. He was to provide weekly written reports. He was not to be seen. He was not to interfere. He was not to make himself known to the husband or to the woman or to anyone connected to either of them. He was, in the language of the agency, to observe only. That is how it began. That is how thousands of cases began. In those years, in the great houses of New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Newport. A letter delivered to a breakfast room. A long silence. A walk to a writing desk. A folded sheet of plain stationery. A man in a soft hat sitting in a reception room. A retainer paid from a private account. A set of instructions given in a low voice. And then the slow accumulation of evidence in plain envelopes, opened in the privacy of a writing room, read once or twice, and burned in the fireplace before dinner. To understand how these women came to have access to such a service, we have to go back a little, to the cold streets of Glasgow in the 1830s, where a young cooper named Alan Pinkerton was learning the trade of making barrels and casks, and where he was also, in the evenings, attending the kind of political meetings that the British government did not approve of. Pinkerton was a Chartist, which is to say that he believed in the radical idea, in those years, that ordinary working men should be allowed to vote. He attended meetings, he printed pamphlets, he marched in processions. The authorities took notice. By 1842, Pinkerton was a marked man, and he and his new wife packed up what they could carry and sailed for the New World, arriving in a tiny prairie town called Dundee in the state of Illinois, where Pinkerton set up his coopering business on the bank of the Fox River. What happened next is one of those small accidents that change the world. Pinkerton, looking for trees to cut for his barrel staves, walked out one day onto a small wooded island in the middle of the river, and he discovered the remains of a campfire that did not belong there. He kept the discovery to himself, and he came back the next night, and the next, and he watched. And eventually he understood that the island was being used as a hideout by a gang of counterfeiters who were passing fake silver coins through the small towns of northern Illinois. Pinkerton went to the sheriff. The counterfeiters were caught. The community took notice of the cooper from Scotland who had a quiet way of watching things, and a head for evidence and an apparent total absence of personal fear. Other cases followed. Pinkerton was offered the position of deputy sheriff. Then he was made a special agent for the United States Post Office, investigating mail theft. Then, in 1850, he founded what he called the Northwestern Police Agency in Chicago, with one small office and an emblem that he designed himself. The emblem showed an open eye surrounded by the words, "We never sleep." The eye became the symbol of the agency, and within a generation the phrase private eye for private detective came from this emblem, and from this small Scottish cooper sitting in a wooden office in Chicago with his pipe and his quiet manner and his absolute conviction that the world could be observed and recorded and made comprehensible. The agency grew during the Civil War, when Pinkerton ran the Union Intelligence Service for General George McClellan, and when his agents smuggled themselves through Confederate lines and brought back maps and troop counts and the kind of information that wins battles. After the war, the agency expanded into railroad work, protecting the express cars that carried payroll and gold across the long prairies of the West, and pursuing the train robbers who tried to take that gold. The names of those pursuits became famous: Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, the Reno brothers. The agency chased them across deserts and through mountains, and it gathered the reputation, in the public imagination, of a relentless and incorruptible force. By the 1880s, the Pinkerton Agency was the largest private police force in the world, larger than the Standing Army of the United States. It had offices in every major American city, and it had branch operations in Canada and in Europe. But the railroad work and the outlaw chasing, which is what the newspapers loved to write about, was only one part of what the agency did. The other part, the larger and quieter part, was what the agency called civil work. Civil work meant divorce. Civil work meant suspected embezzlement by a trusted employee. Civil work meant verifying the whereabouts of a son who had gone west and stopped writing home. Civil work meant determining whether a fiancé was who he said he was. Civil work meant, more and more often as the Gilded Age unfolded, sitting in a small reception room on Fifth Avenue and listening to a woman in a wool morning dress describe a letter she had received from her sister in Boston. Alan Pinkerton himself died in 1884 of a peculiar accident involving a bitten tongue and the gangrene that followed, but his two sons, William and Robert, took over the agency and expanded the civil work considerably. They understood, as their father had not always understood, that the most reliable source of long-term private revenue was not the railroad companies, but the very wealthy private clients, and especially the women among those clients who had specific and recurring needs that the public police forces of New York and Boston and Philadelphia were neither equipped nor willing to address. A New York City policeman was not going to follow a respectable banker to a hotel on 23rd Street. A New York City policeman was not going to discreetly verify the past history of a Hungarian count who had appeared in Newport in July and was paying attention to the only daughter of a Standard Oil executive. A New York City policeman was not going to investigate the financial dealings of a stepfather who seemed to be drawing more from the family trust than the will of the deceased had specified. The Pinkertons did those things. They did them well, and they did them quietly, and they did them for prices that, even by the standards of the very wealthy, were not insignificant. The retainers were measured in hundreds of dollars, and the weekly bills sometimes ran into the thousands. The agency kept its records in a vault in Chicago, and the records were not ordinarily shared with anyone outside the firm, and the existence of a case was treated as a matter of attorney-client privilege, even though the Pinkertons were not attorneys. A woman who hired the agency in 1893 could rely, with a confidence that almost no other relationship in her life would permit, on the fact that her secret would be kept. This was the world into which Adelaide stepped on that Thursday morning in October, when H&M sat down in her reception room with his leather portfolio. She was not the first such woman to do so. She would not be the last. She was simply one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of women of her class and her decade who, faced with a private suspicion they could not voice aloud, walked to a writing desk and reached for a sheet of plain paper and asked for a man in a soft hat to come and help her find out what she needed to know. The work of a Pinkerton operative in the 1890s was for the most part slow and patient and almost entirely tedious. There were no listening devices, there were no cameras small enough to be hidden, except in the most expensive and unreliable models, and even those produced photographs that were rarely useful. There were no automobiles, or rather, the automobile was a curiosity that a few wealthy men drove on weekends in the country, and that no detective could rely on. The work was done on foot, and in horse-drawn cabs and by railroad, and the principal tool of the trade was the notebook. Every operative carried a small leather-bound notebook, of a size that fit into an inside coat pocket, and in this notebook he wrote down everything he observed. The notebooks were ruled, and the entries were dated and timed to the minute, and the language was kept neutral and precise. A typical entry might read, 10:47 a.m., subject left office building at corner of Wall and Broad, walked north on Broad to Pine, hailed cab number 274, gave instructions to driver inaudible, cab departed northbound. The next entry might be made an hour later, when the operative had caught up to the cab and resumed his observation. The day's notebook entries were transcribed each evening into a formal report typed if the office had a typewriter and handwritten if it did not, and the report was filed at the agency office and a copy was sent to the client by sealed courier. The notebooks themselves were considered evidence and were retained by the agency. Many of them survive today, in archives in Chicago and Washington, and reading them is one of the strangest and most intimate experiences a researcher can have, because what the notebooks contain is the minute-by-minute movement, across an ordinary American afternoon, of people who never knew they were being watched. A banker stops at a tobacconist. A young woman walks her dog around a square. A clergyman pauses to speak with a beggar. A husband emerges from his office, looks up at the sky, and walks east toward an appointment that his wife, by the next morning, will know everything about. The operatives themselves were chosen for their ability to be forgotten. They were not tall, they were not handsome, they did not have memorable faces. They wore plain coats and dark hats, and they cultivated a manner of standing on a street corner that suggested nothing in particular. They could become a streetcar passenger, a newspaper vendor, a delivery man with a parcel, a clergyman waiting for an appointment, a beggar in a doorway, a tourist looking lost. They had what the agency called the gift of invisibility, which was not invisibility at all, but rather a kind of profound averageness. A face the eye slid off without registering, a posture the brain forgot before it had finished processing. There were specialists. The agency employed women, in small but significant numbers, beginning very early in its history. Kate Warne, the first woman detective in the United States, was hired by Alan Pinkerton himself in 1856, and she had been instrumental in foiling the Baltimore plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln in 1861. By the 1890s, the agency employed dozens of female operatives who specialized in cases that male operatives could not handle, including domestic surveillance and the surveillance of women. A man could not, in respectable society, follow a young woman through a department store or sit near her at a tea room or trail her to a dressmaker's appointment. A woman could. The female operatives moved through the same spaces as the women they were watching, and they took notes in the same small notebooks, and they reported back to the agency with the same precision. There were operatives who specialized in the financial cases. These were men with backgrounds in banking or law or accounting, who could read a ledger and follow a chain of transactions and detect the small irregularities that suggested embezzlement or trust fund manipulation. There were operatives who specialized in genealogy and in the verification of titles, who could write to county clerks in distant counties and to parish priests in foreign countries and assemble, from the slow accumulation of documents, a complete picture of a person's origin. There were operatives who specialised in what the agency called the European cases, which involved verifying the claims of titled foreigners who had appeared in American society and were paying attention to American heiresses. These operatives often had European backgrounds themselves, and they maintained networks of correspondents in Vienna and Budapest and Rome and Madrid, who could be relied upon to find out within a few weeks whether the count whose card lay on the silver salver in the hall was in fact a count, and whether the estates he had described existed, and whether the family fortune he had implied still existed or had been gambled away 2 generations earlier. The reports themselves followed a standard format. They began with the date and the case number, which was assigned upon the opening of a file and was used internally instead of the client's name. They listed the operatives who had been involved in the week's surveillance, identified only by their agency numbers. They summarised the week's observations in narrative form day by day, with the times and locations noted and the relevant persons identified. They concluded with the operative's assessment, which was always offered as a professional opinion rather than as a conclusion, and which was always carefully separated from the factual record. If the report contained photographs, the photographs were placed in a sealed envelope inside the report, marked with the date and location. If the report contained transcripts of conversations, those were prepared from the operative's shorthand notes, and were carefully marked as having been reconstructed from memory rather than recorded verbatim. The reports were delivered to the client in plain envelopes by a single trusted courier who worked for the agency and not for any outside delivery service. The courier knew the addresses of the clients, but did not know the nature of the cases. The reports were always handed to the client in person, never left with a butler or maid. If the client was not at home, the courier returned later. If the client was travelling, the report was held at the agency until her return. The courier carried in the inside pocket of his coat a list of telephone numbers and addresses that could be used in case of emergency, and he was trained to memorise the list and burn the paper. This was the apparatus that Adelaide engaged on that Thursday morning, and that hundreds of other women of her class engaged in those same years. The apparatus was patient and meticulous and discreet, and it could, given enough time and money, find out almost anything that could be found out. It could not read a mind. It could not predict a future. But it could record the long, slow accumulation of a life, hour by hour and day by day, and it could deliver that record in a sealed envelope on a Thursday afternoon to a woman sitting alone in a writing room overlooking a back garden, where the wisteria was just beginning to turn yellow in the early autumn light. To understand why so many of these women turned to detectives, you have to understand the world they lived in, and to understand the world they lived in, you have to spend some time in Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer months of the 1890s. Newport was not a town. Newport was a stage. Every summer, beginning in the 3rd week of June and continuing until the 3rd week of September, the very wealthiest families of New York and Philadelphia and Boston decamped from their city houses and travelled, by private rail car or by yacht, to the cluster of enormous houses they called cottages that stood along Bellevue Avenue and the Cliff Walk and looked out over the Atlantic Ocean. The cottages were not cottages, the cottages were palaces. The breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, contained 70 rooms. The marble house, built for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva, contained 500,000 cubic feet of marble, imported from Italy and Africa, and assembled by craftsmen who had been brought across the Atlantic specifically for the project. Rosecliff, built later for Teresa Fair Ulrichs, contained the largest ballroom in Newport, an expanse of pale parquet floor under a coffered ceiling that could accommodate 300 dancers without crowding. There were dozens of these houses, some larger and some smaller, but all of them constructed at a scale and an expense that, even in the gilded landscape of 19th century American wealth, was difficult to grasp. The houses were occupied for 10 weeks each summer. During those 10 weeks, the social calendar was so dense and so prescribed that almost no one had a moment of unstructured time. The mornings were for sea bathing, which meant arriving at Bailey's Beach in a long bathing costume and entering the water for the prescribed 20 minutes, and emerging to be wrapped in a heavy linen towel by a maid who had walked down from the house with a hamper. The late morning was for callers, which meant sitting in a particular drawing room at a particular time of day, and being available to receive any of the small number of women who had been authorised to call. The afternoon was for carriage drives along the Ocean Drive, where the carriages moved in a slow, polite procession past one another, and where bows and small nods of recognition were exchanged with the formality of ambassadors at a foreign court. The early evening was for dressing, which took an hour and required the assistance of 2 servants. The dinner was at 8 and lasted until 10, and was followed by either a ball at someone else's house, which lasted until 2 in the morning, or a concert, or a small private theatrical, or, for the very oldest members of the company, a game of bridge in a small upstairs room. Within this calendar, there was almost no privacy. The houses were full of servants, and the servants were full of news, and the news travelled, by way of the back stairs and the laundry rooms and the kitchen yards, between the houses with a speed that no telegraph could match. A woman who quarrelled with her husband at breakfast would find, by tea time, that her closest friend had heard a version of the quarrel and had begun to speculate about its cause. A young woman who danced too many times with the same young man at a ball on Tuesday would find, by Friday, that her mother had received a discreet visit from the mother of another young man, inquiring whether the first young man's intentions were known. Nothing happened in Newport that did not happen in public, even when it happened behind closed doors. For a wife who suspected her husband, or for a mother who feared for her daughter, this density of attention was both a torment and an asset. It was a torment because there was no way to make inquiries directly without becoming the subject of inquiries oneself. It was an asset because, with the right kind of help, the very same density of attention could be used to construct, over a summer, a complete and verifiable picture of another person's daily movements. The Pinkerton operatives knew this. They had operatives stationed in Newport every summer, sometimes openly working for the police as a precaution against the famous jewel thieves who haunted the resort, and sometimes working privately for the women who had wired ahead and made arrangements before they left New York. The operatives in Newport had to be subtler than the operatives in Manhattan, because Newport was smaller and the population was more familiar, and any stranger was immediately noticed. The agency solved this problem by sending operatives who could be plausibly placed in the staff of the resort hotels, or among the workers at the casino, or in the livery of one of the houses that had been rented for the summer to a less famous family. A man in a porter's uniform at the Ocean House could observe the comings and goings of guests with complete freedom, and could note the cards left on a particular sideboard, and could overhear the conversations that took place in the lobby and the dining room. A woman working as a temporary maid in a rented cottage could observe the visitors who came and the letters that arrived and the small disturbances of the household routine that suggested something was being concealed. The reports from Newport were therefore particular in their texture. They were full of small physical details. The flower arrangement in the front hall of such and such a cottage was renewed on Tuesday morning and again on Friday afternoon. The young Hungarian gentleman who had been calling at the Goele house left on Wednesday by the late train to Boston and was observed to be carrying a small leather bag of the kind that contained jewellery. The maid who had been hired for the season at the Ulrichs' house was overheard to be from a village in County Kerry, where her family was known to the family of one of our regular informants. The polo match on Saturday was attended by Mr. So-and-so and Mr. Such-and-such, who left together in the same carriage afterward and proceeded not to Mr. So-and-so's cottage, but to a private residence on Spring Street, where they remained for 47 minutes before emerging separately. The accumulation of such details over a summer formed a portrait. It was not the kind of portrait that would have hung in a parlour, framed in gilt and signed by Sargent. It was a portrait composed of habits and patterns and small departures from expectation. It was a portrait of how a person actually lived, as distinct from how that person presented herself or himself to the world. For a woman who had hired the agency, the portrait was both a relief and a wound. It told her, finally, what she'd wanted to know, and once she knew it, she could not unknow it, and she had to decide what to do. Most of them, it turns out, did very little. The records show that the great majority of these surveillance cases ended not in confrontation, or divorce, or scandal, but in continued surveillance and continued silence. The wife who had hired the agency in October would renew her retainer in January and again in April, and again in July. The reports would continue to arrive in plain envelopes. The information would continue to be read and burned. The husband would continue to come home for dinner, and the wife would continue to sit across the table from him, and the small flame of awareness between them would burn very quietly, on her side at least, and would never be put into words. This is one of the great quiet truths of the period. Knowledge for these women was not always a prelude to action. Sometimes knowledge was itself the action. Sometimes the act of hiring the agency, and of reading the reports, and of knowing what could be known was the entire purpose of the exercise. The agency provided for an annual fee that the woman could easily pay from her dressmaker allowance, a kind of clarity that the rest of her life refused to provide. She could not control her husband. She could not change her marriage. She could not abandon her position. But she could know, and in the small dark hours of a Newport night, with the Atlantic breathing on the other side of the bedroom window and the gas lamp turned down low on the bedside table, knowing was something. It was not much, but it was something, and it was hers, and no one could take it from her, and that was, in its own peculiar way, a kind of agency. In the summer of 1895, a woman we will call Eleanor sat in her drawing room in a townhouse on Madison Avenue and wrote a letter to a man at the Pinkerton Agency in Chicago. The letter concerned her daughter, who was 19 years old, and who was at that moment travelling through Europe in the company of an aunt and a paid travelling companion and 2 maids, and who had been, according to a piece of intelligence Eleanor had received from a cousin in Paris, paying a great deal of attention to a young man whose name Eleanor had never heard. The young man's name was Maurice. He was, by the accounts that had reached Eleanor, the second son of a French family of some distinction but uncertain finances. He had been seen at 3 different dinners in Paris in May, always at the same table as Eleanor's daughter. He had been observed to dance with her at a charity ball in early June. He had been mentioned twice in letters that Eleanor's daughter had written home, in tones that Eleanor's experienced ear identified as significantly more enthusiastic than the tone in which the same daughter wrote about, for example, the Louvre or the Tuileries Gardens. By the 3rd letter, Eleanor had made up her mind, and she sat down at her writing desk and composed a request that took her 2 hours to draft and another hour to revise. The request was complicated because the case involved an American woman travelling in France, which was a jurisdiction the agency could not enter without going through its European correspondence. The Pinkerton Agency had, by 1895, established working relationships with detective agencies in London and Paris and Vienna and a handful of other European capitals, and the practice in such cases was to send a senior operative from the American office to coordinate with the European correspondents, who would supply the local operatives who would do the actual surveillance. The American operative would oversee the work and report back to the client in the agreed format. The arrangement was expensive because 2 agencies had to be paid and a senior American had to be sent across the Atlantic, but for clients of Eleanor's resources the expense was not the obstacle. The obstacle was discretion, because the daughter could under no circumstances learn that her mother was having her followed. The agency assigned the case to a man named, in the records, Operative R. He sailed for Le Havre on the next available steamer, carrying a portfolio of documents and a letter of introduction to the Paris office of the Sûreté and a separate letter of introduction to the private agency the Pinkertons used for their French work. He arrived in Paris on a warm morning in late June, took rooms in a small hotel near the Madeleine, and within 48 hours had a team of 3 French operatives assigned to the case. The team began work the following Monday, and within a week the daughter was being observed at a polite and unobtrusive distance for every waking hour of her day. The daughter, of course, did not know. She thought she was simply travelling. She went to the museums in the mornings with her aunt and the paid companion, who was a woman of 35 who had been hired specifically because she could read in 3 languages and would not contradict anything the aunt said. She lunched at small restaurants the aunt had selected. She drove in the Bois de Boulogne in the afternoons. She attended the evenings that had been arranged for her, which were typically dinners at the houses of family friends or at the embassy receptions to which her family connections gave her automatic entry. She wrote letters home, including her now slightly more careful letters about Maurice, who was not, as it happened, present at any of these arranged events, but who somehow contrived to appear, Maurice's family in some detail. His father held a minor government position. His mother came from a family with a respectable name but no significant fortune. The reports that came back to Eleanor in New York were precise and dispassionate. They described Aero as an older brother who had married a woman of substantial dowry, and who was now living in the country. Maurice himself had been educated at a respectable lycée and at the Sorbonne, where he had taken a degree in law but had not pursued legal practice. He had spent the last 3 years in a series of unspecified pursuits, including a great deal of time at the cafes of the boulevards and a certain amount of attention to the unmarried daughters of visiting American families. There had been, the report indicated, 2 previous American attachments, both of which had ended without engagement, and one of which had ended in a manner that the operative described, with characteristic understatement, as not entirely creditable to the gentleman. Eleanor read the report twice. She made notes in the margin. She did not, at this stage, write to her daughter because she did not yet know what she wished to say, and because the surveillance was continuing and further reports were expected. She wrote instead to her sister, the daughter's aunt, in a letter that did not mention surveillance and did not mention Maurice, but that suggested, with the kind of family code that develops between long-married sisters, that the time in Paris might be approaching its natural end and that an extension of the tour into Italy might be considered. The aunt, who was experienced in these matters and who understood without being told, agreed at once. By the end of the next week, the party had decamped from Paris to Florence, and Maurice, despite some evidence in the operative's report of an attempt to follow, did not appear in Florence, and the daughter, after some weeks of confusion and disappointment, gradually turned her attention to a young American gentleman who happened to be staying at the same hotel, and whose family Eleanor had known for 30 years. The daughter did not learn for many years that any of this had happened. She did not learn until after Eleanor's death, in the early 1930s, when the surviving papers were sorted by an executor, and a small bundle of envelopes was found at the back of a desk drawer tied with a faded ribbon containing the reports from the Paris case and several other cases of similar character. The daughter, by then a woman of nearly 60, sat in her own drawing room and read the reports about her younger self, walking through the Louvre on a June morning in 1895, unaware that 2 French operatives were standing at the other end of the gallery with their notebooks open, recording the precise minute at which she paused before a particular painting, and the name of the young man who at that same minute happened to enter the gallery from the opposite door. What the daughter felt on reading those reports was not recorded. She left no diary entry from that afternoon, but she did write, some weeks later, a short letter to her own daughter, who was at that time 24 and unmarried and travelling in Switzerland, and in the letter she made no mention of the reports she had found, but she wrote, in a tone that her daughter found uncharacteristically gentle, that there was no need to write home every week, and that the family trusted her judgment in all matters, and that the only thing she should remember, in any decision of importance, was to ask herself what she herself wanted, and to be sure of the answer before she acted. The letter was short, and it was warm, and it was the last letter of any length that the daughter and the granddaughter would exchange before the older woman's death the following winter. The granddaughter kept the letter for the rest of her life, in the front of a small leather book on her writing desk, and never knew what had prompted it, and never thought to wonder. There is, in the same archive of plain envelopes and faded ribbons, a different sort of case, and it is the case of a sister who hired the agency not to spy on her husband and not to protect her daughter, but to watch her own brother. The sister, in the records, is called Margaret. She lived in a house on Beacon Hill in Boston, in the upper rooms of a Greek Revival townhouse that had been in her family for 3 generations, and she was, by the date of the case, a widow of considerable means and 44 years of age. Margaret's brother, whom we will call Henry, was 3 years younger than she was. He had been in his youth a young man of charm and promise, a Harvard graduate, a member of the proper clubs, a junior partner in a respectable Boston brokerage firm. He had married a woman from a family the Boston papers approved of, and he had fathered 3 children, and he had bought a house in the Back Bay, and he had, by all the outward signs that mattered in their world, fulfilled every expectation that had been placed upon him. He had also, beginning in his early 30s, developed a relationship with whiskey that gradually crowded out every other relationship in his life. By his late 30s, the brokerage firm had quietly asked him to retire from his junior partnership. By his early 40s, the wife had taken the children and moved to her mother's house in Brookline. By his middle 40s, Henry was living alone in a smaller house on Marlborough Street, supported by an income from a family trust that Margaret, as the older sibling and the principal heir, had a certain quiet influence over. Margaret loved her brother. The records make this clear, not in any direct statement, but in the persistent and almost weary character of her concern. She wrote to him every week. She invited him to dinner every Sunday. She visited him at his house on Marlborough Street whenever she could find a polite reason to do so. She paid, out of her own funds, for the small staff that kept his house from descending into chaos, including a cook and a housekeeper, and a man who came in 3 afternoons a week to manage the small garden in the back. She paid, also out of her own funds, the doctor who called on Henry twice a month, and the small monthly account at the apothecary on Charles Street, and the discreet bills from the men who kept her brother out of jail when, on certain nights, his drinking had carried him into trouble. What Margaret wanted to know, in the spring of 1897, was how much he was drinking and where he was getting the money for it. The trust paid him a monthly allowance that was generous enough to support a careful man comfortably, but that should not have been sufficient to support the volume of drinking that Margaret suspected he was engaged in. There were rumours that he had borrowed money, on occasion, against the expectation of his trust, from men whose business interests Margaret did not wish to encourage. There were also rumours that he had begun to sell, one at a time, the small valuable objects that had been in their family for generations, the silver and the watches and the pair of small Dutch landscapes that had hung in their grandfather's library. Margaret wrote to the Boston office of the Pinkerton Agency, which was located in a building on State Street, and she asked for a representative to call. The representative came on a Thursday afternoon, sat with her in her small upstairs parlour, drank a cup of tea and listened. He did not at any point suggest that her concerns were unreasonable. He did not at any point attempt to broaden the scope of the investigation or to encourage her to spend more than she was prepared to spend. He simply listened, took notes in his small notebook, and proposed a plan that would, for a moderate weekly fee, provide her with a complete picture of her brother's activities over the course of a month. The plan was simple. 2 operatives would be assigned to her brother. They would observe him from the time he left his house in the morning, which was usually around 11, until the time he returned at night, which was sometimes the next morning. They would note the establishments he entered and the duration of his stays in each. They would note the persons he met and, where possible, identify those persons. They would note any transactions that took place, especially any exchange of money or any visit to a pawnbroker or jeweller. They would note his apparent state of intoxication on his return home, and they would describe, in the morning, his apparent state on departure. At the end of each week, the operatives would prepare a report, and the report would be delivered to Margaret in a plain envelope by the agency's courier. The reports, when they began to arrive, were heartbreaking in their precision. Henry left his house most mornings at 11:30 and walked, with what the operative described as a careful but unsteady gait, to a small establishment on Washington Street called Donovan's, where he drank on the first morning observed 3 glasses of whiskey and read the newspaper for an hour. He then walked to a tobacconist on Tremont Street, where he purchased cigars and accepted from the proprietor the cashing of a small personal cheque. He then returned to Donovan's, where he was joined by an older gentleman in a brown suit who was identified by the second operative through inquiries with the sûreté equivalent of the Boston police as a man known to operate as a private moneylender to gentlemen of reduced means. The 2 men remained at Donovan's for 2 hours. When they emerged, the older gentleman accepted from Henry a small parcel, the contents of which the operative could not determine but which were estimated by weight to be approximately the weight of a small silver object. The reports went on like this for 4 weeks. They described a daily pattern that was, in its sad uniform, more devastating than any single revelation could have been. Henry was drinking, on average, the equivalent of a full bottle of whiskey a day. He was selling, at a rate of approximately 2 items per week, the small, valuable objects from his house. He was borrowing, at predatory rates of interest, from the gentleman in the brown suit, and from 2 other men of similar profession whom the operatives identified over the course of the month. He was eating almost nothing. He was speaking in the establishments he frequented almost entirely about the past, and especially about his college years and his early marriage and the lost promise of his early career. Margaret read the reports in her upstairs parlour, with the curtains half drawn against the afternoon light, and when she had finished reading each one she folded it carefully and placed it in the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken and finally vanish into ash. The reports did not tell her anything she had not already suspected, but they confirmed what she had needed to confirm, and they identified the men who were enabling her brother's decline, and they provided her with the names and the addresses and the patterns of behaviour that would allow her to act. She did act, but what she did was not what one might have expected. She did not confront her brother, because she had learned over many years that confronting Henry produced only more drinking. She did not write to his estranged wife, because that lady had her own troubles and did not deserve to be drawn back into Henry's. She did not, as another woman in her position might have done, instruct the trustees to cut off her brother's allowance. because she understood that cutting off the allowance would not end his drinking but would only end his shelter and his food and the small dignities that the allowance still bought him. She did not, in short, do what she did instead was very quiet and very strategic, and entirely characteristic of the way these women operated in the world. She used the names of the moneylenders, which the operatives had supplied, to make discreet inquiries through her own family attorney about the legal status of the debts those gentlemen had extended to her brother. The attorney, working through the agency, was able to determine that the debts had been extended at rates of interest that exceeded the limits permitted by Massachusetts law, and that the documents Henry had signed were therefore not fully enforceable. The attorney was further able to determine, through correspondence with the police, that 2 of the 3 gentlemen had outstanding matters with the authorities that they would not wish to see escalated. Armed with this information, Margaret's attorney called, in the most polite possible manner, on each of the 3 gentlemen in their respective places of business, and explained to them, with great courtesy and at considerable length, that the family of Mr. Henry was aware of the loans that had been extended to him, and that the family considered those loans to have been extended on terms that were not entirely in keeping with Massachusetts law, and that the family would prefer, going forward, that no further loans of any kind be extended to Mr. Henry, and that if any such loans should happen to be extended, the family would feel obliged to make certain inquiries with the police that the gentleman might find inconvenient. Most beneficiaries brought very little attention. They had been raised, deliberately and from childhood, to consider financial matters indelicate and confusing and outside the proper sphere of feminine attention. They received their quarterly allowances, and they signed the documents they were given to sign, and they trusted the trustee because the trustee had been chosen by their father, or their husband, or their grandfather, and because trust, in the language of the period, was a moral category as well as a legal one. To distrust your trustee was to suggest that your father had chosen poorly, and to suggest that your father had chosen poorly was a kind of disloyalty that respectable women did not permit themselves. But some beneficiaries, particularly as the 1890s turned into the early 1900s, and the new century began to suggest new possibilities, brought more attention than this. Some of them began to read their quarterly statements with care. Some of them began to ask questions about specific investments. Some of them, when their questions produced answers that did not satisfy them, began to make inquiries elsewhere. The case we will consider concerns a woman we will call Charlotte, who was 31 years old in the autumn of 1902, and who had inherited from her father a portion of a Midwestern grain fortune. The fortune had been placed by her father's will under the management of 3 trustees. 2 of the trustees were attorneys who served largely in a ceremonial capacity. The 3rd trustee, who held the active responsibility for managing the assets, was a man we will call Mr. Bradley. Mr. Bradley was 62 years old, a senior partner in a respected New York banking house, a member of the Union Club and the Knickerbocker Club, and a man whose name carried, in the financial community of Lower Manhattan, the kind of weight that opens doors and closes mouths. Charlotte had inherited at 21, 11 years earlier, and for the first 8 of those years she had paid little attention to the management of her trust. She had received her quarterly statements. She had noted with satisfaction that the income appeared to be sufficient for her needs, and she had signed whatever documents Mr. Bradley sent her with a brief note attached. She had married, in her middle 20s, a young man from a Philadelphia family of moderate means, and her husband had taken some interest in the trust, but had concluded, after a polite meeting with Mr. Bradley, that the management was sound and that no intervention on his part was required. In the autumn of 1902, Charlotte's husband died. He died young, of a sudden illness, leaving her with 2 small children and a household that she now had to manage entirely on her own. The widowhood, which was a devastating personal blow, also produced, as a side effect, a sharpening of her attention to financial matters. She found herself, for the first time in her life, reading her quarterly statement with care. She found, on closer reading, that certain items in the statement did not entirely match her recollection of the dispositions she had been told about in previous years. She found that the income, while still sufficient, had been gradually declining over the past 4 years in a pattern that did not seem to match the general direction of the markets. She found, on consulting an almanac, that several of the railroad bonds the trust had held 5 years earlier appeared no longer to be in the portfolio, and that the bonds that had replaced them were not familiar to her. She wrote to Mr. Bradley with her questions. Mr. Bradley wrote back in a tone of avuncular reassurance. explaining that the changes in the portfolio reflected prudent diversification and that the slight decline in income reflected a deliberate shift toward more secure investments. He invited her to visit the bank if she wished to review the records in person. She did not, at this stage, take him up on the invitation because she was still in mourning and because the prospect of sitting in his office and asking him pointed questions filled her with the kind of dread that her upbringing had carefully cultivated. But she did, after some weeks of further reflection, write a letter to the Pinkerton Agency in New York. The case was assigned to an operative with a background in commercial accounting. He was a man in his middle 40s, formerly an accountant at a Boston firm, who had joined the agency 5 years earlier and had specialized since then in cases involving the management of trusts and the verification of financial records. His method in such cases was patient and indirect. He could not, of course, simply walk into Mr. Bradley's bank and demand to inspect the trust records. But he could, with the appropriate introductions and with Charlotte's authorization, make inquiries through other banks about the status of specific securities. He could, with patience, track the chain of title for particular bonds through the records of the various clearinghouses and brokerages that handled them. He could, with care, identify the brokers who had been involved in the transactions that had moved certain securities out of the trust and certain other securities in. What he found over the course of 6 months of patient inquiry was a pattern that was both common and devastating. Mr. Bradley had been engaged for at least 4 years in the practice that the financial community of the period referred to discreetly as accommodation. He had been selling securities held by Charlotte's trust at prices slightly below their market value to brokerages in which he or his close associates held interests, and he had been buying, with the proceeds, other securities at prices slightly above their market value from the same brokerages. The differences in each individual transaction were small. But the transactions had been many, over 4 years, and the cumulative effect was that approximately $170,000 of the trust's value had been quietly transferred, through these small differences in price, to the accounts of Mr. Bradley and his associates. In the financial scale of 1902, this was a considerable sum, though not a fortune by Charlotte's standards. It was, however, a clear and documentable case of fiduciary self-dealing, and the operative's report, when it was complete, ran to 140 pages, with appendices, and was accompanied by certified copies of the transaction records he had assembled through his patient inquiries. Charlotte read the report. She read it twice. She had it reviewed by an attorney in Philadelphia who had been a friend of her father and who was not in any way connected to Mr. Bradley or to his bank. The attorney confirmed the operative's conclusions and recommended a course of action. The course of action, when Charlotte adopted it, was not a lawsuit and not a public confrontation. The course of action was a single private meeting in Mr. Bradley's office in Lower Manhattan on a winter morning in early 1903, attended by Charlotte and by her Philadelphia attorney, and by Mr. Bradley, and by a senior partner from his bank whom Charlotte had specifically requested be present. At the meeting, Charlotte's attorney presented in a brown leather folder a summary of the operative's findings, with the supporting documents attached. He explained that Mrs. Charlotte was not interested in pursuing legal action, and that she was not interested in any public discussion of the matters that had come to her attention, but that she would require, as a condition of allowing the trust to continue under its present management, certain immediate adjustments. She would require the resignation of Mr. Bradley as active trustee, and his replacement by a man of her own selection, whose name she provided. She would require the restoration to the trust, by Mr. Bradley personally, of the sum of $170,000, with interest at 5% compounded annually from the dates of the relevant transactions, payable within 60 days. She would require, going forward, the quarterly statements to be accompanied by supporting documentation in a form her own accountant could review. She would require, in addition, a private apology, which would not be shared outside the room, but which would be made, and which Mr. Bradley would understand was the price of the family's continued silence on these matters. Mr. Bradley listened in silence. His face, which had begun the meeting in a posture of avuncular welcome, grew gradually paler as the attorney spoke. When the attorney had finished, Mr. Bradley did not speak for some time. He looked at the folder. He looked at the senior partner from his bank, who was looking at him with an expression that was difficult to read, but that contained nothing of friendship. He looked finally at Charlotte, who was sitting with her gloved hands folded in her lap and who had not, throughout the entire presentation, spoken a single word. He agreed to everything. He had no choice. The senior partner from the bank had not been informed of the situation before the meeting, and the bank's reputation was at that very moment being held in the balance, and the only way to preserve the bank's reputation was for Mr. Bradley to resign at once, and to make restitution at once and to ensure that the matter never became public. Mr. Bradley resigned at the end of the meeting. He retired from the bank within the month. He made the restitution with interest within 40 days. He wrote the apology, in his own hand, on a single sheet of paper, and Charlotte read it once and placed it in the same locked drawer in which she kept the operative's report, and she did not show it to anyone else for the remaining decades of her life. The new trustee, a man Charlotte's father had known and had once considered for the role, took over the active management of the trust. The quarterly statements began to arrive with supporting documentation. The income, freed from the steady drag of the previous arrangement, increased over the following years. Charlotte raised her 2 children. She remarried in her late 40s, a quiet widower from her own social circle, with whom she lived for the remaining 30 years of her life, in a kind of placid happiness she had not previously believed possible. And in the locked drawer of her writing desk, the operative's report sat undisturbed, accompanied by the brown folder from the meeting in Mr. Bradley's office and by the single handwritten apology, until Charlotte's own death in 1941. By then the documents had become, in a sense, historical objects. The world they described had passed. The Pinkerton agency was now mostly a security guard service. The kinds of accommodation that Mr. Bradley had practiced had been outlawed, or partially outlawed, by the Securities Acts of the early 1930s. The wealthy women of the new century had access to professional financial advice from women who held degrees in economics and who worked at firms that hired women as analysts and even occasionally as partners. The world had changed. But on the autumn afternoon when Charlotte's executor sat at her writing desk and opened the locked drawer, the world that had produced these documents was still close enough to be felt. The executor read the report. She was a granddaughter, a young woman of 24 who had recently graduated from Vassar and who was beginning a career in journalism. And as she read the report, she felt the past pressing very close. She understood, perhaps for the first time, what her grandmother had done. She understood the kind of patience and the kind of intelligence that had been required by a young widow in mourning to detect the slow theft she'd been subject to and to organise, with quiet competence, the response that had ended it. She understood that her grandmother, whom she'd known only as a soft-voiced lady who wore lavender and who knitted in the afternoons, had once stared down a 62-year-old senior partner of a New York bank and had made him return 100. The granddaughter sat at the desk for a long time. Then she did what her grandmother would have wanted her to do. She returned the documents to the drawer, locked the drawer, and made a note in her own private papers to ensure that the drawer remained locked and the contents undisturbed for as long as she lived. The instruction, in slightly altered form, was eventually passed to a great-granddaughter, who passed it to her own daughter, and the documents sit today in a vault in a private archive in Connecticut, where they will sit presumably for as long as the family endures. They are unread, they are unburned, they are, like Charlotte herself in her later years, simply present, waiting, and not, in any obvious way, doing anything at all. In the summer of 1905, a woman we'll call Beatrice received, at her cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine, a letter of introduction from a friend in Vienna. The letter introduced a young gentleman, recently arrived in America, who was the second son of a noble family of considerable antiquity, and who was travelling for the purpose of acquainting himself with American business methods. The friend in Vienna wrote that the young gentleman was a person of excellent education and impeccable manners, that his family had welcomed her into their home on her recent visit to the Tyrolean Alps, and that any small attentions Beatrice could pay to him during his sojourn in America would be received as a personal kindness. The young gentleman was Count Maximilian von something, the precise spelling of which appears differently in different documents. He was 27 years old. He was tall, blonde, fluent in 3 languages, possessed of a manner that combined respectful deference with the kind of self-assurance that comes from never, in 27 years, having been required to wonder where one's next meal would come from. He arrived at Bar Harbor on a Tuesday in late June, bearing the letter of introduction and a small valise, and a calling card so finely engraved that the writing seemed almost to be raised from the paper rather than printed on it. He took rooms at the Hôtel de Ile, which was the better of the two large summer hotels at Bar Harbour, and he sent the letter of introduction up the hill to Beatrice's cottage by the hotel messenger, with a note in his own hand asking when it would be convenient for him to call. Beatrice was at this time 49 years old. She had been widowed 7 years earlier. She had 2 daughters, both of whom were of marriageable age, and neither of whom had yet made a match that satisfied Beatrice's expectations. The older daughter, who was 23, had been the subject of attentions from several young Americans of acceptable background, but none of those attentions had produced an engagement, and the daughter herself had displayed a quality of romantic restlessness that Beatrice recognized, from her own youth, as a quality requiring careful management. The younger daughter, who was 20, was still, in her mother's judgment, young enough to be properly directed. When Beatrice read the letter of introduction, she felt something more complicated than simple welcome. She felt first the natural pleasure of receiving a courteous letter from a respected friend. She felt second, the more strategic pleasure of recognizing that a young European gentleman of evident background and unattached status had been deposited on her doorstep at a moment when the older daughter was much in need of a serious distraction. She felt, third, the wariness that experienced mothers in her position had been developing throughout the previous quarter-century, as the phenomenon of the European fortune hunter had grown increasingly familiar to American society. The newspapers had been writing about it for years. The phrase "dollar princess" was already in common use. The cautionary tales were many. She did not, as another woman might have done, simply invite the Count to dinner and trust to her own instincts to evaluate him. She did not, on the other hand, refuse the introduction or treat the Count coolly, because the letter from Vienna was warm, and her friend in Vienna was someone whose judgment she trusted. She chose instead a middle path. She wrote to the Count by return messenger inviting him to dinner the following Saturday. She wrote, in the same hour and by a separate post, to the New York office of the Pinkerton Agency, requesting that a senior operative be dispatched to Bar Harbour at the agency's earliest convenience for a confidential consultation. She wrote by yet another post to a cousin in Vienna who was not the same person as the friend who had written the original letter of introduction, asking her cousin to make discreet inquiries about the Count's family among the connections she maintained at the imperial court. This was the work of a single afternoon, and Beatrice did all of it without raising her voice, without indicating to anyone in her household that anything unusual was occurring, and without spending more than the price of 3 letters and the postage to send them. The combined apparatus that she set in motion, however, would, over the following 6 weeks, produce a verification of the Count's standing that no informal inquiry could have achieved. The Pinkerton operative who arrived at Bar Harbour the following Monday was a man we have met before, the senior operative who handled the European cases and who maintained the network of correspondence in the various capitals. His method, in cases of this kind, was tiered. The first tier was the verification of the basic facts. Did the family the Count claimed to belong to actually exist? Did it hold the title it was said to hold? Were the estates described in the standard genealogical references actually owned by the family at the present time, or had they been sold, mortgaged, or lost? Were the Count's parents alive, and if so, where were they currently residing, and did they appear to be in good health and good repute? These questions, which sounded straightforward, in fact required a considerable network to answer, because the answers depended on documents held in church registries and county land offices and the social registers of multiple European capitals, none of which were easily accessible to anyone without local connections. The second tier was the verification of the Count himself. Was he in fact the second son of the family, or was he a more distant relation travelling under a borrowed identity? Had he received the education he claimed to have received, and were the universities he had attended willing to confirm his record? Had he served in the appropriate military regiment, and if so, what was his record there? Had he, in his previous years in Europe, accumulated debts that might be expected to follow him to America? Were there, in his past, any incidents involving women of the upper classes that had been settled discreetly, but that nevertheless had left a record in the discreet circles where such records were kept? The third tier was the assessment of intent. This was the most subtle part of the inquiry, and it depended on a combination of factual evidence and the operative's professional judgment. Why was the Count in America? Was his travel financed by his family or by independent means? If by his family, what was the family's evident strategy in supporting his travel? If by independent means, what were those means? How long was he expected to remain in America, and what was his expected destination after his American visit? Had he in previous travels paid attention to other unmarried women of substantial fortune? And if so, what had been the outcome of those attentions? The answers came in over the following weeks, in a series of cables and letters that the operative collected at the Bar Harbor Telegraph Office and transcribed into a single comprehensive report. The Count's family, it turned out, was real, and the title was real, and the estates were largely real, though one of the smaller properties had been mortgaged to a Viennese bank for an amount that suggested the family's finances were perhaps less robust than they appeared in the standard references. The Count himself was the second son. He had received the expected education at the expected institutions. His military service had been adequate. His past in Europe was, on the whole, creditable, though there had been an incident some 4 years earlier involving the daughter of an American banking family who had been visiting Vienna, and that incident had been concluded by means of a small financial settlement made by the banking family to ensure that the Count would not pursue the daughter further. The settlement had been modest by American standards, but significant by the standards of the Count's family finances, and the operative judged that this incident, more than any other single fact, was the key to understanding the present visit. The Count was not a swindler. He was not a fraud. He was a real Count of a real noble family that was somewhat short of cash, and he had been sent to America, at his family's expense and with his family's encouragement, to find an American heiress whose fortune would restore the family's financial position. He was, in short, a perfectly ordinary specimen of the dollar princess phenomenon, neither better nor worse than the European average. The operative's report was 400 pages long. The cousin in Vienna's letter was a single page. The friend in Vienna's letter, the original introduction, was, of course, the cover under which the entire arrangement had been initiated. When Beatrice had read all 3 documents, she sat in her drawing room at Bar Harbor on a warm August afternoon, with the windows open to the Atlantic and the sound of the surf coming up the hill from the rocks below, and she considered what she would do. What she did was elegant in its restraint. She did not refuse the Count further invitations. She did not warn her older daughter. She did not write to her friend in Vienna to express any displeasure at the introduction. She simply continued to receive the Count at her cottage for the remaining 6 weeks of the Bar Harbor season, and she ensured, by a careful arrangement of dinner partners and excursion parties, that her older daughter was not seated next to him at any social occasion. She arranged for the older daughter to be invited to a series of yachting parties in Newport that took her away from Bar Harbor for 2 of the most important weeks of the Count's visit. She arranged for the younger daughter, who was less susceptible to romantic notions, and who was in any event too young to be a serious target of the Count's intentions, to be the Count's primary social partner at the various Bar Harbor entertainments. The younger daughter, who found the Count rather pompous, and his stories about his ancestral castle tedious, was an effective if unconscious agent in her mother's strategy. By the end of the season, the Count had concluded that the family was a less promising prospect than he had hoped, and he departed for Newport in early September, where he attached himself for the remainder of his American visit to a different family entirely. The older daughter never knew, the Count never knew, the friend in Vienna never knew. The only people who knew were Beatrice, the Pinkerton operative, the cousin in Vienna, and eventually the older daughter's husband, whom the older daughter married 3 years later, who was a young American attorney from Boston of acceptable family and growing professional reputation, and to whom Beatrice eventually confided the entire story on the night before the wedding as a way of explaining why she had so warmly encouraged his courtship and why she had so deftly arranged the seating at every dinner during the previous summer. The young attorney, who was a man of humour and discretion, listened to the story with delight and married Beatrice's daughter the next morning and lived with her for the next 47 years and never told her any of it, because as he later explained to Beatrice on the day of their first grandchild's christening, some stories should be kept for the women who lived them and not for the daughters who never had to. There is something, in many of these case files, that resists the simple narrative of employer and employee. The relationships between the women who hired the agency and the operatives who served them developed, over years of patient correspondence, into something more complicated than a simple commercial arrangement. The operatives knew, after some time, the most private details of the women's lives. The women knew, after some time, the names of the operatives' children, and the small particulars of their habits and the limits of their tact. The professional courtesy that began the relationship gave way, in many cases, to a kind of working trust that resembled friendship without quite becoming friendship. Consider the case of a woman we will call Frances, who first engaged the agency in 1894 when she was 38 years old in connection with a matter concerning her husband. The matter was resolved in a manner that did not require either confrontation or divorce within 6 months. But Frances did not, at the end of that 6 months, terminate her engagement with the agency. She extended it, on a much reduced retainer, as what the agency called a watching brief. The watching brief meant that the agency continued to maintain a passive interest in certain matters, that no active surveillance was being conducted, but that the agency stood ready on short notice to resume active work if Frances should request it. The retainer for a watching brief was modest, and it was paid quarterly, and it served for Frances as a kind of insurance. Over the next 27 years, Frances engaged the agency in matters of varying kinds. She engaged it in 1901 in connection with her older son, who had begun, at the age of 20, to display certain habits that worried her. The investigation, which lasted 3 months, established that the habits were less alarming than she had feared, and the agency's quiet word with certain of the son's associates was sufficient to bring those habits under control. She engaged it in 1905 in connection with the suitor of her younger daughter, with results similar to those in the case of Beatrice and her count. She engaged it in 1909 in connection with a younger sister whose marriage was producing certain concerning rumours. She engaged it in 1913 in connection with the management of a charitable foundation she had established, where she had begun to suspect that one of the salaried officials was diverting funds to his own account. She engaged it in 1917 in connection with her older son again, who by then was a married man with children of his own, and who was in some danger of being drawn, by patriotic enthusiasm during the war, into business arrangements that Frances correctly suspected to be unsound. Throughout this entire period, the principal operative assigned to Frances's cases was a man we will call Mr. Sherwood. Mr. Sherwood had been a young operative when he was first assigned to her case in 1894. He was by then in his early 30s. He had been chosen for the original case because of his manner, which combined deference with intelligence in a particular way that the agency's case manager had judged would suit Frances's temperament. The judgment had been correct. Frances had taken to Mr. Sherwood immediately, and she had requested, when she engaged the agency on the watching brief, that Mr. Sherwood continue as her principal contact. He did. Over the next 27 years, Mr. Sherwood rose through the agency's ranks, becoming a senior operative and then a regional supervisor, and then, in the years before his retirement, an officer of the New York office. Through all of these professional advancements, he continued to handle Frances's matters personally, even when, as her case manager, he was technically too senior to take direct field assignments. The correspondence between Frances and Mr. Sherwood, which has survived in the papers of his family, is one of the most remarkable documents of the period. It begins, in the 1890s, in the formal voice that the agency's procedures required. Frances addresses him as Mr. Sherwood. He addresses her as Madam. The letters discuss the substance of cases in the careful, periphrastic language that the agency had developed for written correspondence, which avoided naming specific subjects or specific allegations, and which referred to the various parties involved by code names that had been agreed in person. But over the years, the tone of the letters softens. By the early 1900s, Frances is asking after Mr. Sherwood's family. By the 1910s, Mr. Sherwood is including, in his official reports, small personal notes about matters that have come to his attention and that might be of interest to Frances, even though they fall outside the scope of any active case. He mentions, on one occasion, that an old neighbour of hers, whom he knew she'd been concerned about, had been seen at a particular charity event and appeared to be in improved health. He mentions, on another occasion, that a young woman whom Frances had befriended some years earlier, and whose subsequent disappearance had troubled her, had been observed by an operative working on a different case in New Orleans, where she appeared to be living quietly and unharmed under a new name. These small gestures were not, strictly speaking, part of the agency's services, but they were part of the relationship that had developed between Frances and Mr. Sherwood, and Mr. Sherwood understood without being told that Frances would value the information. The letters also begin, over the years, to include matters that are not investigations at all. Frances writes to Mr. Sherwood for his advice on the disposition of certain charitable bequests in her will. She writes to him about the engagement of one of her granddaughters and asks whether the family of the proposed bridegroom is one with which the agency has any familiarity. She writes to him, on the occasion of his retirement in 1924, a long letter expressing her gratitude for 30 years of service and her hope that his retirement will be a long and happy one. He writes back, in a letter that is uncharacteristically warm and personal, expressing his appreciation for her trust and his pride in having served her well, and concluding with the observation that he has, over those 30 years, learned more about the conduct of life from observing her than he had learned from any other source. Mr. Sherwood lived for another 9 years after his retirement, and during those years he and Frances continued to correspond, less frequently, but with greater warmth. He died in 1933 of pneumonia at his home in New Jersey. Frances received the news from his eldest son, who had been instructed by his father to write to her personally upon his death. Frances was, by then, in her late 70s, and her own health was failing, but she sent flowers to the funeral, which she did not attend, and she wrote a letter to Mr. Sherwood's widow that the widow kept for the rest of her own life, and that her descendants have kept since then. The letter was 3 pages long. It described, with a discretion that conveyed everything without saying anything, what Mr. Sherwood had meant to her. It described him as one of the most reliable men I have ever known, and it concluded with the observation that there are some friendships in life that arise from circumstances so peculiar that they cannot be explained to those who are not part of them, but that are no less true for that and no less treasured. Frances herself died 11 months later. Her papers, when they were sorted, included a small leather book containing the names and dates of every case the agency had handled for her over the previous 40 years, along with brief notes in her own hand about the outcomes. The book also included a separate section devoted entirely to Mr. Sherwood, containing the dates of his various correspondences with her, the names of his children, the dates of significant events in his family life, and, at the very end of the section, the date of his death, written in a hand that had grown shaky with age and underlined twice. This is the part of the story that the broad summary always misses. The women who hired the agency were not in the main paranoid or vindictive or controlling. They were in the main women who had been placed in positions of considerable responsibility, with very few of the social tools that would have allowed them to discharge that responsibility directly, and who had found, in the agency, a way of extending their reach into corners of the world they could not enter personally. The operatives, in turn, were not in the main mercenary or callous or indifferent. They were professionals who had developed, over years of work with the same clients, a respect for those clients that sometimes deepened into something more difficult to name. The relationship between the woman who could not, by reason of her sex and her class, walk into a counting room and demand to see a ledger, and the man who could, by reason of his profession and his discretion, do precisely that, was one of the quiet collaborations of the period. It was not equal, because nothing in that period was equal, but it was, in its own way, mutual, and it lasted in many cases for decades. Imagine the houses. Imagine them late, after dinner has ended and the guests have gone and the servants have finished their final tasks and have retired to the upper floors. The drawing rooms are dim. The fire has burned down to embers, glowing red against the dark of the grate. The gas lamps have been turned down to a low blue flame just enough to see by. The heavy curtains are drawn against the cold of the night, against the gas lamps of the avenue outside, against the slow rattle of the occasional carriage passing on the wet street. In one such drawing room, on a winter night in 1898, a woman sits in a high-backed chair near the fire. Her dress is dark green silk, plain in cut, the kind of dress that one wears in the evening at home when no one is expected. Her hair is pinned up loosely in the manner of a woman who is preparing for bed. On the small table beside her chair is a cup of tea, gone cold an hour ago, and not refreshed because she did not wish to ring for the maid. Beside the cup is a small stack of papers, perhaps 20 pages, all of them written in the same precise hand, all of them dated within the previous week. The papers describe the movements of a man who is, at this moment, in a bedroom on the second floor of the same house, sleeping the heavy, untroubled sleep of a man who does not suspect that his life has been observed and recorded. The woman reads each page slowly. She's not surprised by what she reads. She has read similar pages each week for the past 3 months. She has by now a complete picture of the situation. The man on the second floor has a separate life. The separate life is conducted with care and with discretion, and it does not at present threaten the household or the children or the social position of the family. The separate life consists principally of a small apartment in a respectable building in Murray Hill, where a woman of about 30 lives, quietly under a name that is not her own, supported by a quarterly payment from the man on the second floor that is generous, but not extravagant. The woman in the apartment does not appear in the records of any public scandal. The man visits her, on average, twice a week, in the afternoon, for periods of 2 or 3 hours. The visits have been continuing for approximately 4 years. The financial arrangements have been continuing for the same period. There is no evidence that either party intends to alter the arrangement, or that either party expects the arrangement ever to become public. The woman by the fire considers all of this. She has been considering it in various forms for 3 months. She has reached this evening a kind of decision. The decision is not the decision the world would expect a betrayed wife to reach. She has decided that she will do nothing. She will not confront her husband. She will not divorce him. She will not write to the woman in Murray Hill, or arrange for the woman to be discovered, or take any step that would make the arrangement public or unstable. She has decided that the arrangement is, for her own purposes, acceptable. Her husband is good to her in the ways that matter to her. He is good to the children. He is, when he is at home, kind and attentive and present. He has not, in the 4 years that this arrangement has apparently been going on, given her any cause for complaint in the management of their household or in the conduct of their public life. The separate life appears to be in its own way a small private matter that he conducts privately, and that does not subtract from the share of his attention that is hers. She has decided that she would rather know than not know. She would rather have the weekly reports than have the absence of them. The reports are her ground. They tell her where she stands. They give her, in a world that offers very few certainties to women in her position, one certainty she can hold in her hand. The certainty is small. It is the certainty of facts. It is not the certainty of love or of happiness or of any of the larger questions that her mother and her grandmother had taught her not to ask. But it is enough. It is... She places the papers in the small leather portfolio she keeps in the bottom drawer of the writing desk. She locks the drawer. She places the key on a ribbon that she wears around her neck under her dress. She rises from the chair. She crosses the room to the fire and adjusts the screen so that the embers will not throw a spark on the carpet during the night. She turns down the lamp on the desk. She walks slowly through the dark hall to the staircase, holding her hand along the polished banister, and climbs to the second floor where she enters her own bedroom, which is separated from her husband's by a small dressing room and a closed door. She prepares for bed in the way that she has prepared for bed every night for 15 years. She lies down. She lies very still in the dark. She listens to the sounds of the house settling, the small clicks and tickings that are familiar to her, in a way that no human voice has ever been familiar. She listens to the distant sound of her husband's breathing on the other side of the dressing room. She thinks for a moment about what the operative who is presently observing her husband's movements is doing at this hour. She imagines him, perhaps, in a small rented room in Murray Hill, sitting by a window with a notebook in his lap, watching the door of a particular building, waiting for the light in a particular window to go out. She wonders what it is like to spend one's life watching other people's lives. She wonders whether the operative thinks about her, the woman who is paying him, as he watches. She falls asleep, finally, very slowly. The house is silent. The fire in the drawing room downstairs has gone out. The lamp on the writing desk is dark. The papers are locked away. Outside, on the avenue, the lamplighter has long since finished his rounds, and the gas lamps burn their low yellow flames against the cold December night, illuminating nothing but their own small circles of pavement. Somewhere in the city, an operative is making notes in a small notebook. Somewhere in the city, a woman in a small apartment in Murray Hill is also lying still in her own bed, thinking her own thoughts, which are not, perhaps, very different from the thoughts of the woman in the great house on Fifth Avenue. Both of them are sleeping in some way in the same architecture. Both of them are held in some way by the same long invisible hand of money and convention and the careful management of appearances. Both of them are doing what women have always done, which is to find, within the very narrow space that has been allotted to them, the kinds of small private freedoms that allow them to breathe. The drawing room is empty. The fire is out. The lamp is dark. The papers are locked in the drawer. The woman in the dark green silk dress is asleep upstairs. The husband in his separate room is asleep beside her. The operative who's been watching them, hours ago now, walked the long distance from Murray Hill to his own modest rooms in a boarding house in Chelsea, and is asleep there, with his notebook on the small table beside the bed, ready for the morning. The woman in the apartment in Murray Hill is asleep too. The whole long invisible chain of watchers and watched is silent. The city is silent. The snow has begun to fall on Fifth Avenue, soft, slow, unobserved. The night holds them all. By the time you reach this point in the story, the question has perhaps formed itself in your mind. Why did they do it? Why did these women, who had everything that the world counted as everything, spend so much of their hidden time and their hidden money on the project of finding out what was being kept from them? Why did they not simply ask? Why did they not simply confront? Why did they accept the cost, the financial cost and the emotional cost, and the cost of carrying secrets they could not share? The answer is not simple, but it has, at its heart, a single recognition. They did it because they had no other tool. In the world they had been born into, direct confrontation was not available to them. A wife who confronted her husband risked, at minimum, social humiliation. A mother who confronted her daughter risked, at minimum, the rupture of the relationship she was trying to protect. A sister who confronted her brother risked, at minimum, his withdrawal into a further isolation that she could not penetrate. A widow who confronted her trustee risked, at minimum, the suggestion that her grief had unbalanced her judgment. The tools available to them, in the standard repertoire of 19th century female life, were tools of indirect influence. A woman could write a tactful letter. She could arrange a seating chart. She could intervene through an intermediary. She could withhold her favour in carefully calibrated doses until the desired behaviour was achieved. These tools were powerful when they worked, but they all depended on a single condition. The woman had to know what she was responding to. She had to know what was actually happening beneath the smooth surface of her social world, in the lives of the people around her. The Pinkerton Agency and the other agencies of similar character supplied that knowledge. They supplied it discreetly, professionally, and at a cost that the wealthy women in question could absorb without difficulty. They turned, in effect, the invisible into the visible, and they handed the result over in a plain envelope to be opened in the privacy of a writing room. What the woman did with that knowledge was her own affair. The agency did not advise. The agency did not judge. The agency simply observed and recorded and reported, and left the consequences to those who had asked the questions. The consequences varied. We have seen, in the cases discussed so far, a range of outcomes. Adelaide, whose husband was seen at the hotel on 23rd Street, did not divorce him, did not confront him, and did not, so far as the records show, ever mention the matter to him. She continued the surveillance for 2 more years and then quietly let it lapse, and she lived with her husband for another 19 years until his death. And she ran her household with her customary grace, and no one outside of her own self knew, until her papers were sorted after her own death, that she had ever known. Eleanor, whose daughter was followed in Paris, ended the situation without ever revealing it, and the daughter married happily and raised her own children and lived in untroubled ignorance for the rest of her life. Margaret, whose brother was drinking himself into ruin, used the information to protect him quietly and to extend his life by some years, without ever telling him she had done so. Charlotte, whose trustee was stealing from her, recovered the money and replaced the trustee and never spoke of the matter publicly. Beatrice, whose daughter was being courted by a fortune hunter, redirected the courtship, and the daughter married another man and never knew that her summer in Bar Harbour had been quietly choreographed by her mother. Frances, who used the agency for 40 years, conducted her entire managed life on the basis of information she could not have obtained otherwise, and she lived to a serene old age and left no public scandal behind her. In every case, the woman acted on the information without revealing that she had it. This is the essential pattern. It is what distinguishes these stories from the more dramatic narratives we are used to reading. The women did not, on the whole, want spectacle. They did not want to be seen as having acted. They wanted instead to act in ways that preserved the appearance that no action had been taken. They wanted the river to keep flowing in its accustomed channel, with a small adjustment they had quietly made hidden under the surface where no one would notice it. This was not, as it might appear, a failure of nerve. It was a particular kind of strength that the period demanded. To act publicly, in their world, was to invite consequences that would fall not only on themselves, but on their husbands and their children, and their wider families and their social position. To act privately, with the help of professionals who could be relied upon to keep silent, was to preserve the structures that supported their lives while making the small necessary corrections that allowed those structures to continue functioning. It was, in a sense, the principle of conservation applied to the social order. They did not wish to remake the world. They wished to keep the world they had been given in working order, with the small repairs that experience had taught them were necessary. What it cost them is harder to measure. The financial cost was, for women of their resources, negligible. A weekly retainer of $50, a monthly bill of $100 or $200, an annual outlay of perhaps $2,000 or $3,000 on a serious case, was a sum that disappeared into the larger accounts of households that spent that much on flowers each season. The cost in money was not the issue. The cost in something else, which is harder to name, was more considerable. To know, and to keep on knowing, and to keep that knowledge entirely to oneself, is a particular kind of burden. The women who hired the agency added to the already considerable burdens of their position the additional burden of carrying private knowledge that could not be shared. They could not discuss it with their husbands, of course, who were often the subjects of the inquiry. They could not discuss it with their friends, who were part of the same social world and whose own situations might overlap with the subjects of the inquiry. They could not discuss it with their daughters, who were not yet old enough to bear such confidences. They could not discuss it with their priests or their doctors or their attorneys, except in the narrowest professional contexts. They could discuss it with the operative, who was a professional bound by discretion, and they could discuss it, in some cases, with a single sister, or a single very old friend whom they trusted absolutely. Beyond those exceptions, they carried it alone. It was, on balance, a burden that most of them seemed able to bear. The records suggest that the women who used the agency lived, on average, lives that were no shorter and no less healthy than the lives of their contemporaries who did not. They did not, on the whole, become bitter or paranoid or unstable. They continued to function in their accustomed roles, to entertain and to be entertained, to manage their households and their charities and their children. The private knowledge, far from poisoning them, seems in many cases to have steadied them. It gave them, paradoxically, a kind of peace. They knew where they stood. They knew what they were dealing with. They were not, in the largest sense, in the dark. There is a phrase that recurs in the few private writings that have survived from these women, when they refer obliquely to the work of the agency. The phrase is, the comfort of knowing. They write of the comfort of knowing what they are facing. They write of the comfort of knowing the shape of the situation. They write of the comfort of knowing even when what they know is not what they had hoped to find. The comfort of knowing. It is a strange phrase, perhaps, in this context, but it captures something essential. For women whose lives had been organized, from infancy, around the principle of not asking, the act of asking and receiving an answer, even an unwelcome answer, was a small and private revolution. It restored to them a portion of agency that the larger structure of their lives had taken away. It said to them, in the privacy of their own minds, that they were not, in the deepest sense, helpless. They could not change the world, but they could understand it, in pieces, in their own time, in their own way. And understanding, for a woman whose principal training had been in the suppression of inconvenient questions, was a form of freedom that could not be measured by any of the usual instruments, but that was, all the same, real. When the agency began to consolidate its files for storage, in the early decades of the 20th century, the question arose of what to do with the civil case records. The criminal case records, which related to the agency's work with railroads and corporations and government bodies, were considered to have ongoing value and were maintained in active files at the various branch offices. The civil case records, which related to the private domestic and financial investigations of individual clients, were considered to be of no further commercial value, but they were also considered to be of considerable potential embarrassment if they were to be improperly disclosed. The decision was made sometime in the 1920s to consolidate the civil records into a single archive at the Chicago headquarters of the agency, and to maintain that archive in a secure vault under the supervision of a senior records officer. The records officer was charged with the responsibility of preserving the records, but also of preventing access to them by anyone except authorized personnel of the agency, and, in certain very limited circumstances, the clients themselves or their authorized representatives. The records were filed by case number, with cross-references by client name, by subject name, and by date, in a system that had been developed over the previous 50 years, and that was, by the standards of the period, remarkably sophisticated. The vault itself was located in the basement of the agency's building on Wells Street in Chicago, behind a steel door of considerable thickness, and it contained, by the late 1920s, approximately 300,000 individual case files, occupying a series of metal shelves that ran the length and width of a room that was perhaps 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The shelves were arranged in long parallel rows, with narrow aisles between them, and they were lit by bare electric bulbs that hung from the ceiling and that were turned on only when the vault was in active use. The temperature in the vault was kept low to discourage the deterioration of the paper. The humidity was controlled. The records officer made his rounds twice daily, checking for any sign of pest infestation or water damage, and he kept a logbook of everyone who entered the vault, with the time of entry and the time of departure and the case numbers consulted. For the next half-century the vault sat undisturbed. The agency continued to function, though its work shifted gradually away from the kind of patient civil surveillance that had characterized its earlier decades. The railroad cases declined as the great age of train robbery passed into history. The labour cases, which had been a source of considerable controversy and revenue in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were curtailed by federal legislation in the 1930s that limited the use of private detectives in industrial disputes. The civil cases, the kind that had filled the vault on Wells Street, also declined, partly because the legal framework around marriage and inheritance had been transformed by reforms that gave women direct access to courts and to legal representation, and partly because the development of professional financial advice meant that women like Charlotte could now consult certified public accountants and registered investment advisors, rather than relying on private detectives to detect fiduciary misconduct. The agency, in its later 20th century incarnation, became primarily a provider of security guard services, with offices around the country supplying uniformed guards for banks and warehouses and corporate facilities. The civil casework had not entirely disappeared, but it was a small fraction of the company's revenue, and the kinds of cases handled in the modern era were different in character from the ones that filled the vault. The vault itself became, gradually, a kind of forgotten room. Records officers came and went. The agency moved its headquarters more than once, and the vault contents were moved with it, packed in identical metal cabinets and transported by truck and reinstalled in new basements and new buildings. The contents were never reviewed. They were simply preserved as a kind of institutional habit. In the early 1970s, the agency was acquired by a larger security firm, and in the course of the acquisition, the question of what to do with the historical records was raised. The new owners, who were not interested in maintaining an archive that had no commercial value, considered destroying the records. But the records by this point had attained, by reason of their age, a kind of historical interest, and there were academics who had begun to inquire whether the materials might be made available to scholars. After a period of negotiation, an arrangement was reached. The bulk of the historical records, including the civil case files from the 1860s through the 1920s, were donated to the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress, which had the staff and the facilities to preserve them properly and to make them available, under appropriate restrictions, to qualified researchers. The records arrived at the Library of Congress in 1967 in a series of shipments that filled an entire truck. They were unloaded onto loading docks behind the Madison Building, transferred by handcart to processing rooms in the basement, and gradually, over the course of the next several years, catalogued, indexed, and shelved in the permanent collections. The civil case files, which had been the most sensitive of the records, were placed under restrictions that prevented direct access by the public for a period of 50 years from the date of each file's creation, in order to protect the privacy of any persons who might still be living, or whose immediate descendants might be living. By the early 21st century, however, most of the files we have discussed in this story had passed beyond the 50-year restriction and had become available to qualified researchers on application to the manuscript reading room. It is in those reading rooms, in the quiet basement levels of the great research libraries, that the work of recovering these stories is now being done. A researcher arrives in the morning. She presents her credentials. She fills out a call slip for a particular box of records. She waits, sometimes for an hour, while the box is retrieved from the closed stacks. She's taken to a long table, where she may use only pencils, no pens, and where the box is placed before her, and where she's permitted to open the folders one at a time and to read the documents inside. The documents, in their plain manila folders, contain everything we have been discussing. They contain the original letters from clients, written in the sloping copperplate hand of the 1890s on the heavy cream paper of the period. They contain the operatives' weekly reports, typed on the early typewriters whose keys produced a slightly uneven impression that varied from one machine to another and that the records officers had learned to identify by sight. They contain the bills, itemised down to the penny, listing the cab fares and the train tickets and the hotel rooms and the small expenses of surveillance work. They contain the receipts, signed in pencil by the operatives who had received payment. They contain, occasionally, the small physical objects that had been part of the investigations, including photographs and pressed flowers and locks of hair and, in one famous case, a pawn ticket from a small establishment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, dated October of 1894, for a piece of jewellery that had been sold by a dishonest servant and recovered by an agency operative the following week. To handle these documents, even at a distance of more than a century, is to feel the long, silent presence of the women who created them. The letters in particular have a quality that cannot quite be conveyed in summary. They were written by women who never imagined that any stranger would read them. They were written for a single purpose, to communicate a specific request to a specific professional, and they were composed with the care that women of that era brought to all of their written correspondence, but with a directness that the same women would not have used in any other letter. They are, in some sense, the most honest documents we have from these lives. They are not the polished social letters that the women wrote to their friends. They are not the careful family letters that the women wrote to their mothers. They are not the diplomatic letters that the women wrote to manage their charities and their household accounts. They are the letters in which the women said, quietly and directly, what they actually needed. The researcher, sitting at the long table in the manuscript, is not quite sympathy, because the women's lives are sufficiently distant that direct identification across the gap of a century is impossible. It is closer to something like recognition. The researcher recognises, in the careful drafting of the letters, the same kind of practical intelligence that women in difficult situations have always brought to the management of those situations. She recognises the particular kind of patience that learning to operate without direct power requires. She recognises the particular kind of courage that hiring a professional to investigate one's own family represents. And she closes the folders at the end of the day and returns the box to the librarian, and walks out of the reading room into the afternoon and carries with her, for some time afterward, a sense of having spent the day in the company of women whose names she may never know, but whose presence she will not soon forget. Picture a particular evening, in the late summer of 1904, on the cliff walk at Newport. The path runs along the edge of the cliff, between the bedroom windows of the great cottages and the long drop to the rocks below. It is a path that the public is permitted to use, by an old easement that the property owners have grumbled about for generations but have never been able to undo, and it is therefore, of all the places in Newport, the one place where members of the household staff and visitors to the resort and the residents of the great houses are all able to walk side by side without the rigid separation that governs almost every other space in the town. It is around 9 o'clock in the evening. The sun has set perhaps half an hour ago. The western sky still holds a faint pale colour, but the eastern sky over the Atlantic has darkened to a deep blue that is not quite night. The lighthouses up and down the coast have begun their slow rotation, and you can see from the cliff walk the white flash of the Beavertail light to the south and the slower red flash of Castle Hill to the north. The air is warm, the wind is light. The sound of the sea, which is always present at Newport, is gentler than usual, a slow even breathing rather than the surge and crash of stormier weather. On the cliff walk near the rear gardens of one of the great cottages, a woman is walking slowly, alone. She is dressed in a pale evening gown with a light shawl over her shoulders. She has slipped away from the dinner that is still going on in the cottage behind her, on the pretext of needing a little air, and she's taking advantage of the brief absence to think. She's 34 years old. She has been married for 10 years. She has 2 small children who are asleep at this hour in the nursery of the cottage. She has, in the leather case in her bedroom upstairs, the most recent report from the agency, which she received yesterday by special courier. The report has confirmed what she had suspected and what she had not yet allowed herself to fully believe. She walks slowly. She listens to the sound of the sea. She does not yet weep. The weeping, if it comes, will come later, in the privacy of her own bed, and she has trained herself over many years to weep without sound. For the moment, she walks. She watches the lights of the lighthouses turning their slow signals to the ships at sea, which she cannot see but knows are there, somewhere out beyond the dark line of the horizon. She thinks about her children. She thinks about her mother, who is dead, and to whom she would not, even if her mother were alive, be able to speak of this. She thinks about the operative whose name she's been writing to once a week for the past 3 months, and whom she has never met in person, and who has become, in some odd way, the one figure in her life with whom she can be entirely truthful. She thinks about her husband, who is at this moment sitting at the head of his own dinner table, on the other side of the cottage windows, laughing with the senator who is the guest of honour, and who does not know that his wife knows. She reaches a small bench that has been placed at one of the wider points of the cliff walk, where the path bulges out toward the sea, and where there is room for a single iron bench under a single small lamp. She sits down. The lamp above her is electric, one of the new electric lamps that the Resort Association has begun installing along the public paths, and its yellow light makes a small warm circle in the surrounding dark. She holds her hands in her lap. She breathes, slowly, in time with the slow breathing of the sea below. She does not yet know what she will do. She does not yet have a plan. She has, for the moment, only the knowledge, and the night, and the sound of the water, and the small electric lamp above her head. She sits there for perhaps 15 minutes. Eventually she becomes aware that she has been gone from the dinner too long, and that her absence will soon be noticed, and that she must return before any awkward questions are raised. She rises from the bench. She straightens her shawl. She walks back along the path the way she came. As she passes the rear gardens of the cottage, she pauses for a moment in the dark and looks up at the lighted windows of the dining room, where she can see, through the lace curtains, the figures of her dinner guests gathered around the long table. The figures are blurred by the curtains. They look, from where she is standing in the garden, like figures in a painting, slightly unreal, gilded by the light from within. She watches them for a moment. Then she turns away and walks toward the side door that leads into the conservatory, and she enters the cottage, and she takes off her shawl, and she goes back to the dinner, and she resumes her place at the foot of the table, and she smiles at the senator and asks him about the weather in Washington, and no one in the room except herself ever knows that anything has happened. This is what these stories are made of. They are made of the moments on the cliff walk under the small electric lamp. They are made of the slow walk back to the cottage. They are made of the smile at the foot of the table, the question about the weather in Washington, the resumption of the role that the woman has been playing for 10 years and that she will continue to play for many years more. They are made of the small invisible adjustments by which she will, over the coming months, manage her situation, without ever revealing that she is managing anything, without ever indicating to her husband or to her children or to her guests that she knows what she knows. They are made, in short, of the slow, patient work by which women of her time held their worlds together while the worlds themselves were quietly coming apart, and held them together so well that the worlds appeared, from the outside, to be perfectly intact. In Philadelphia, on a quiet street near Rittenhouse Square, there lived a woman we will call Harriet, who had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and who was, in the early years of the new century, beginning to grow concerned about her middle son. The middle son was named, in the records, only as William, though that may not have been his actual name. He was 22 years old in the spring of 1906. He had finished his college years at the University of Pennsylvania the previous summer. He had been expected by his family and by his father in particular to enter the family bank, which was a small but respected institution in the Philadelphia financial community, and to begin the slow training that would qualify him, in due course, to take a place among his older brother and his cousins on the bank's management committee. William had begun this training in September of 1905. He had attended at the bank dutifully for 3 months. He had learned the elementary procedures of the deposit office and the basic forms of correspondence that the bank used in its dealings with its country clients. He had, by the accounts that reached Harriet through her husband's reports at the dinner table, made a reasonable beginning. But in December, he had begun to take more days off than the bank's schedule permitted. By January, he was attending only 3 days a week. By February, he had stopped attending altogether. His father, who was a man of few words and considerable patience, had spoken with him several times in the manner that men of that family used to speak with one another about difficult matters, which was a manner of indirection so refined that someone outside the family would scarcely have understood that any reproof was being delivered. William had received these conversations politely and had agreed, on each occasion, to resume his attendance, and had not, in any case, done so. By March, Harriet had begun to make her own quiet inquiries. William still lived in the family house, in his old bedroom on the 3rd floor, and he was still present at most meals, and he was still polite to his mother and to the servants, and he had not by any external sign given any indication of being in distress. But he was changing, in ways that a mother could detect and that no one else perhaps could see. He was thinner. He was sleeping later in the morning. He was spending his afternoons in pursuits that he did not describe, returning home in time to dress for dinner and then disappearing again after dinner, often not returning until very late at night. He had become, in some way that Harriet could not name, less present. He was in the house, but he was not in it. He was at the table, but he was not at it. He moved through the family rooms like a guest who had stayed too long and had stopped feeling welcome but did not know where else to go. Harriet did not at first suspect any specific thing. She suspected, in the general way that experienced mothers suspect, that something was wrong, and she suspected that she was not going to find out what it was by asking directly, because William's particular style of withdrawal was the style that closes more deeply under direct inquiry. She did, therefore, what other women of her circle had done before her. She wrote to the Philadelphia office of the Pinkerton Agency. She requested a representative to call. The representative came on a Wednesday afternoon, sat with her in her small upstairs parlour, drank a cup of tea, and listened. The case that was open that afternoon ran for 4 months, and it produced a report that Harriet, when she finally received the full document, read in a single sitting from beginning to end, without putting it down, and then read again from the beginning. The report told her what was happening to her son, and the answer was not, as she had perhaps half feared, that he was involved with a woman, or that he was drinking, or that he was gambling, or that he had fallen into any of the conventional traps that the sons of wealthy families fell into. The answer was, in some ways, more difficult to absorb. Her son was reading. He was reading in a particular way, in a particular place, with a particular group of other young men, and the reading was the principal activity of his afternoons and his evenings, and it had been the principal activity of his afternoons and evenings since the previous November. The place where he was reading was a small house on a side street in the Northern Liberties section of Philadelphia, which a small group of young men had rented together as a kind of informal meeting place. The young men were a mixed group. Some of them were from families like William's, some of them were from working-class backgrounds, a few were immigrants from Russia or Poland. They had come together, at first, through a series of evening lectures at a settlement house in the same neighbourhood, and they had eventually decided to rent the small house in order to have a place where they could meet on their own schedule and read together and argue about what they read. What they were reading was political philosophy of a kind that, in the Philadelphia of 1906, would have been considered by most of the city's respectable families to be dangerous. They were reading Marx and Engels and Kropotkin and Bakunin. They were reading the recent novels of Maxim Gorky in English translation. They were reading the pamphlets of the American socialist and labour movements. They were, in short, conducting their own informal university in a small house with a coal stove and a kitchen and a single shared sitting room, where they sat on mismatched chairs in the evenings and argued about the conditions of working people in the great industrial cities and about the possibility that the social order that surrounded them might be, in the not-too-distant future, replaced by an order that was different and more just. The operative who had compiled the report did not, on the whole, share the political views of the young men. The agency's history in matters relating to labour and political organising was on the side of the established order, and the operative had been trained to view the readings these young men were conducting as the early phase of a process that could, if not interrupted, produce dangerous consequences. But the operative was also a thorough professional, and he had been instructed to report what he found, not what he thought about what he found, and the report he produced was meticulous and even-handed. It described the young men by name, with brief biographies of each, drawn from the operative's inquiries among their families and former teachers. It described the readings they had undertaken, with summaries of the principal texts and lists of the discussions that the operative had been able to observe or to reconstruct from interviews with neighbours. It described William's particular role in the group, which was, by the operative's account, a thoughtful and somewhat detached one. William was not, the report indicated, a ringleader. He was not, the report indicated, the most ardent participant. He was instead a young man who appeared to be undergoing a slow process of intellectual change, who was working out, in the company of these other young men, what he himself believed, and who had not yet arrived at any conclusions, but who was thinking, more deeply than he had ever thought before, about questions that the previous 22 years of his life had not prepared him to ask. Harriet read this. She read about the small house in the Northern Liberties. She read about the young men with their unfamiliar names. She read about the books her son was reading, most of which she had never heard of. She read the operative's description of William sitting on a low chair near the coal stove on a winter evening, with a book on his lap, listening to one of the older young men describe a particular passage from Marx, and asking, after a long pause, a question that the operative had been able to reconstruct only in part, but that appeared to concern the relationship between economic systems and individual conscience. She read the operative's professional assessment, which was that William was not in any immediate danger of doing anything that would bring legal trouble or public embarrassment on his family, but that he was, in the operative's view, undergoing a profound change in his understanding of the world, and that this change, if it continued on its present trajectory, was likely to make it very difficult for him to return to the bank or to live, in the long term, within the expectations of his family. Harriet sat with this report for 2 weeks. She did not in that period mention any of what she had learned to her husband. She did not in that period mention any of it to her older son or to her daughter. She did not mention it to William. She did not change, in any visible way, the pattern of family life. She continued to preside at the dinner table. She continued to receive callers in the afternoons. She continued to consult with the housekeeper about the menus and with the gardener about the spring planting in the small back garden. She continued, in short, to be exactly the woman she had been before the report arrived. And then, at the end of the 2 weeks, she did something quietly remarkable. She went to her bank, which was not, of course, her husband's family bank, but rather a separate institution where she maintained her own personal accounts, under the terms of a marriage settlement that had been drafted when she was 22 years old, and that had given her, by the somewhat unusual provisions of her father's will, control over a portion of her own family's wealth that was independent of her husband's authority. She withdrew from this account a sum that was significant but not excessive. She placed the sum in a small leather wallet. She returned home. She wrote a short note in her own hand. She placed the wallet and the note in an envelope. She gave the envelope to the housekeeper with instructions that it was to be left on William's writing desk in his room, in such a way that he would find it when he returned that night, but that it was not to be mentioned to anyone else in the household. The note, the operative learned later, when he made his final inquiries before closing the case, said only this. It said, "Dear William, I have been thinking about you a great deal. I do not understand everything that is happening in your life, but I trust you, and I want you to have what you need. Please use this in any way that helps you. Do not feel that you owe me any explanation. I love you, your mother." What William did with the money is not recorded in the agency files because Harriet closed the case the following week, and the operative's final report contains only the observation that Harriet had indicated, with thanks, that the agency's services would no longer be required and that the matter had been resolved to her satisfaction. We know from later family records that William left the family bank for good in the spring of 1906. We know that he moved out of the family house the following autumn and took rooms of his own in another part of the city. We know that he continued to be present at family events for the rest of his life, but that he never returned to the bank and that he eventually entered a profession that was not associated with finance, and that was associated with the kinds of social questions he'd been thinking about in the small house in the Northern Liberties. We know that his mother continued to see him regularly, and that the relationship between them, far from being damaged by the divergence in their views, became, by all accounts, the closest of any in the family. We know that William was at his mother's side when she died many years later, and that he held her hand for several hours during her final afternoon, and that he wrote, in a small notebook he kept for the rest of his own life, that his mother had been the only person in his entire family who had ever, in any moment of his life, simply let him be who he was. The agency report, with the operative's careful notes about the small house in the Northern Liberties, sat in the vault on Wells Street for 60 years before it was transferred to the Library of Congress, and it sits now in a folder in a closed box in the manuscript division, where it will sit for as long as the institution endures, as one of the quiet, permanent records of a woman in Philadelphia who used the apparatus of professional surveillance not to control her son but to understand him, and who used the understanding to give him what he needed, and who did all of this without ever telling him she had done any of it. There is, among the records, a case that involves not one woman but three sisters from a single family, who hired the agency jointly to look into a matter concerning their eldest brother. The sisters were all over 40 at the time of the case, all married to men of substantial position, all running their own households in different cities, and all bound to each other by the close ties of a family that had been, for 2 generations, prominent in the social life of the American South before relocating, in the 1870s, to New York. They were a formidable group when they acted together, and the case in question is one of the few in the archive where they did. The brother, who we will call Robert, was the eldest of their generation. He was 52 years old in the autumn of 1908. He had inherited, on the death of their father some 20 years earlier, the controlling interest in the family enterprises, and he had managed those enterprises with reasonable competence for 2 decades. He had married, in his early 30s, a woman from another prominent family, and they had 3 children, all of whom were now grown and settled. He had, by every external measure, conducted his life along the lines that his father had marked out for him, and he had brought neither distinction nor disgrace to the family name. The matter that concerned his sisters was peculiar. It was not a matter of personal conduct. There were no rumours about Robert's marriage, no whispers about gambling, no signs of any of the conventional failures. The matter was, instead, a matter of the family enterprises. The sisters had begun to notice, over a period of perhaps 3 years, that the dividends from those enterprises, which were distributed to all 4 of them in proportions established by their father's will, had been declining in a pattern that the sisters could not understand. The enterprises themselves, by all reports, were continuing to do well. The American economy in those years was robust. The industries in which the family had its principal interests were prosperous, and yet the dividends were declining year by year in modest but consistent increments that, over time, had become significant. The sisters had each, in her own household, raised the matter with her husband, in the careful manner that wives raised business matters with their husbands in those years. The husbands, who were all men of professional accomplishment in their own fields, had each, in turn, made polite inquiries with Robert. Robert had given each of them the same general answer. He had said that the businesses were facing increased competition, that certain investments had not produced the returns expected, that the management had been compelled to reinvest a larger portion of the earnings in modernization and expansion, and that the dividends would, in due course, recover. The husbands had reported these answers to the sisters with varying degrees of conviction. The sisters had compared notes, by letter, and on the few occasions when they were able to visit one another in person, and had concluded that something was not right. What was not right they did not yet know, but they had decided that they wished to find out. They had agreed, in a series of letters that they exchanged over the spring and summer of 1908, that they would jointly engage a professional to look into the matter. They had agreed that none of them would inform her husband of the engagement, because the husbands, while supportive, were also part of the larger social and business community in which Robert moved, and any of them might inadvertently reveal the inquiry through some perfectly innocent remark. They had agreed that the engagement would be made through one of the sisters, the middle one, who lived in New York and who was therefore best placed to communicate with the agency on a regular basis. They had agreed on the amount each of them would contribute to the expenses, which they would draw from their personal accounts in equal portions, and they had agreed on the kind of information they wished to obtain. The case, when it was opened in September of 1908, was assigned to the senior operative who specialized in financial cases, the same man who had handled Charlotte's matter 6 years earlier. He met with the middle sister at a small private dining room in a hotel near Grand Central Station, where she could come and go without being observed by anyone who would know her, and where the operative was able to take careful notes on the family situation and the businesses in question. He explained, at this meeting, the kind of inquiry that would be necessary and the kind of time it would require. The investigation, he warned her, would not be quick. Tracing the financial flows of a complex enterprise required patient work in many directions, and the work could not be hurried without compromising its accuracy. She accepted his estimate of 6 months and his estimate of the cost, and she paid the initial retainer in cash from a sum she had brought for the purpose. And she returned to her own house and wrote letters that evening to her 2 sisters, indicating that the matter was in train. The operative's work over the following 6 months took him from New York to several cities where the family enterprises maintained operations. It took him to the offices of suppliers and to the offices of customers. It took him to the records rooms of railroads that carried the family's products. It took him to the offices of insurance companies that had insured those products. It took him, in due course, to a small office in Lower Manhattan that occupied 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building on Liberty Street, and that bore on its frosted glass door the name of a Manhattan lawyer who specialized in commercial matters of a particular and discreet kind. The lawyer was the key. The investigation eventually established that Robert had, beginning some 5 or 6 years earlier, engaged this lawyer to create a series of intermediate companies that stood between the family enterprises and certain of their major suppliers and customers. The intermediate companies were owned, through a structure of nominee shareholders, by Robert personally, rather than by the family enterprises. They added a small markup to every transaction that passed through them. The markup was small enough not to attract attention from any individual transaction, but it had been applied over 5 years to every contract that the lawyer and Robert had been able to route through the structure, and the cumulative effect was that approximately $300,000 in profit had been quietly diverted from the family enterprises into Robert's personal accounts, by way of the intermediate companies and the Manhattan lawyer. The operative's report, when it was complete, ran to almost 600 pages with appendices, and was accompanied by a chart drawn in the operative's own careful hand that traced the flow of funds through the intermediate companies and back into Robert's personal accounts. The chart, which was attached as the final exhibit of the report, was, by the operative's own account, the most elaborate single document he had ever prepared for a client, and it had taken him 3 weeks to construct from the underlying records he had assembled. The middle sister, when she received the report at the hotel near Grand Central Station, did not read it there. She placed it in a leather case she'd brought for the purpose, paid the operative the final instalment of his fee, thanked him with a formality that conveyed her real gratitude, and took the report home in a closed carriage. That evening, in her own writing room, she read the report from beginning to end. She read it 3 times. She then wrote, on her own stationery, 3 identical letters to her 2 sisters, asking each of them to come to New York at her earliest convenience on a matter of family business that she was unable to describe in writing. She sent the letters by special delivery the following morning. The 3 sisters convened in New York within 10 days. They met at the middle sister's house, in the same upstairs parlour where the case had begun, and they spent 2 full days reviewing the report together. They went through every page. They asked one another questions. They discussed the implications of what they had learned, both for the future of the family enterprises and for the relationship between themselves and Robert. They considered and rejected several courses of action that involved public disclosure or formal legal action. They considered and accepted a course of action that was quieter but more decisive. The course of action, when they implemented it, was a model of coordinated family discipline. The 3 sisters travelled together to Robert's office in Lower Manhattan on a Wednesday morning without prior notice. They were received by his secretary with some surprise but with full courtesy, and they were shown into his private office. Robert, who had not seen all 3 of his sisters together in his office in many years, greeted them with a combination of pleasure and apprehension. The sisters seated themselves. The middle sister placed the leather case on the desk between them. She opened it. She removed the report. She handed it to Robert and asked him, without preamble, to read the summary on the first page. Robert read the summary. His face changed slowly. He did not speak. He read the second page. He read the third page. He flipped to the chart at the back. He looked at the chart for some time. He closed the report and looked at his sisters. His sisters looked back at him. The silence in the office for some minutes was complete. The middle sister then spoke. She spoke quietly and without anger. She said that the sisters did not wish to pursue legal action against him. They did not wish to expose him publicly. They did not wish to damage his marriage or his children's prospects or the family's standing in the community. But they did wish certain things. They wished the intermediate companies to be dissolved immediately, and all current contracts to be redirected through the family enterprises in the normal manner, they wished restitution to be made to the family enterprises for the full amount that had been diverted, with interest, payable within 90 days. They wished an immediate change in the management structure of the enterprises, to bring in a senior outside executive who would oversee operations and report to a committee that included representatives of all 4 siblings. They wished, in addition, a private undertaking from Robert that no such arrangements would ever be entered into again, with any party at any time in any form. Robert agreed. He had, like Mr. Bradley before him, no choice. The evidence was complete, the consequences of public disclosure would have been catastrophic, and the relative privacy of the proposed resolution was a gift that he had to accept. He signed, that afternoon, a series of documents that the middle sister had prepared in advance, with the help of an attorney unconnected to the family, and the documents were placed in a safe in the attorney's office, where they were to remain unless their existence should become necessary to enforce. The intermediate companies were dissolved within 30 days. The restitution was made with interest within 80 days. The outside executive was hired within 4 months and began work in the spring of 1909, by which point the family enterprises were already showing the first signs of the recovery that the legitimate underlying business had been masking. The 3 sisters returned to their respective households. They did not speak of the matter to their husbands. They did not speak of it to their children. They wrote to one another over the following years in the careful coded language that they had developed for any reference to the events of 1908, and they observed, in their letters, that the family enterprises were thriving and that Robert's relations with them remained cordial. They observed, on a few occasions, that Robert seemed to have aged considerably since the events in question, and they expressed in private the hope that he had taken the experience as a kind of warning rather than as a kind of grievance. By the time Robert died, in 1916, the relations among the 4 siblings had been entirely repaired in the visible sense, and the matter of the intermediate companies had passed into the kind of silence that is so thorough as to amount in practical effect to forgetting. But it was not, of course, really forgotten. The 3 sisters carried it for the rest of their own lives, and they died. The oldest in 1924, the middle one in 1931, and the youngest in 1937, without ever discussing the matter with anyone outside their own 3-person circle. The report, with its chart and its appendices, was kept by the middle sister in the safe in her writing room, and it was found, after her death, by her own daughter, who was the executor of her estate, and who read it with astonishment, and who, after consulting with her aunts, who were still living and who confirmed the entire story, deposited the report in a sealed bundle in the family's safety deposit box at a New York bank, where it remained for another 70 years, until a great-granddaughter, going through the contents of the deposit box during a routine review of family papers, opened the bundle and read the report, and donated it, in a state of considerable family historical excitement, to the manuscript collection at the New York Public Library, where it now sits, available to any researcher who knows to ask for it. The case of the 3 sisters illuminates something else that runs through these stories, which is the role of women's networks of communication. The sisters did not invent, for the purpose of their inquiry, a method of writing to one another that would shield their discussions from prying eyes. They simply applied, to the unusual circumstances of 1908, the system of indirect reference that women of their class had been using for generations to discuss matters that could not be addressed openly. The system was elaborate in a quiet way. It involved the use of code names for persons whose actual names could not safely be put in writing. It involved references to events that were described in terms so general that only a person already familiar with the underlying situation could understand them. It involved metaphors drawn from gardening or from sewing or from the weather, which could carry, between initiated readers, meanings entirely different from their literal sense. It involved the careful omission of dates and locations that might allow an outside reader to identify the matters in question. It involved, in short, an entire literary practice, developed over generations by women whose correspondence might at any time be read by husbands or fathers or brothers or servants or mothers-in-law, and who had therefore learned to write about important matters in ways that conveyed everything to their intended readers and almost nothing to anyone else. Reading the surviving correspondence of women like the three sisters is, for that reason, a peculiar experience. The letters seem, on a first reading, to be entirely concerned with trivial matters. They discuss the weather. They discuss the health of various distant relatives. They discuss the progress of certain plants in the garden. They report on the success or failure of various sewing projects. They mention small social occasions. They include, almost always, a paragraph or two of reflection on a particular text the writer has been reading, often a poem or a passage from scripture. They conclude with affectionate references to the recipient's family. But on a second reading, with the key that contextual research provides, the same letters reveal themselves to be carrying a quite different conversation. The weather is not the weather. The health of the distant relative is not health. The progress of the plants in the garden is a coded report on the progress of a specific situation. The sewing project is a metaphor for a financial or social arrangement. The text the writer has been reading has been chosen because of a specific passage that addresses indirectly the matter under discussion. The recipient who knows the context reads the letter once for the literal content and a second time for the actual content, and writes back in the same form, with her own contributions to the substantive discussion encoded in the same way. The Pinkerton Agency was aware of this practice. The operatives who handled the correspondence with female clients had been trained in part to read between the lines of the letters they received, in order to understand the full nature of the client's concerns, even when those concerns could not be stated directly. The agency's own correspondence with its female clients had developed a parallel system of careful indirection, in which the operatives reported on the substance of cases in language that was technically precise, but that avoided any term that could be considered indelicate or that could embarrass the client if her correspondence were ever to be read by anyone else. The result was a kind of dual literacy that women of the period developed without ever being formally taught it. They could read, on a single page, both the surface meaning and the underlying meaning of any letter they received, and they could compose, in a single sitting, a letter that operated on both levels with equal grace. The skill was not unique to women, of course. Men of various periods and circumstances have developed similar skills for similar reasons, but it was, in the world we're considering, particularly characteristic of women, because women had particularly acute reasons to need it, and because women had developed it across many more generations than the men of their own time had needed to. This is why the records of these cases are so often on the surface so disappointing. A researcher who comes to the archives expecting dramatic revelations is likely to be initially puzzled. The letters look at first like quite ordinary letters. The reports look at first like quite ordinary reports. It is only when one has spent some time with the materials and has begun to recognize the patterns of indirection that govern them that the underlying narratives begin to emerge. The narratives, when they do emerge, are the more powerful for the patience required to find them. They are not the loud narratives of public scandal. They are the quiet narratives of long, careful management, conducted by women who could not act openly, and who therefore became, of necessity, extraordinarily good at acting in ways that no one would notice. There is, in the records, a small document that has no investigative significance, but that has, for the reader, a peculiar emotional weight. It is a single sheet of paper attached by a small brass clip to the back of one of the case files, in handwriting that is not the handwriting of the operative who handled the case, and that appears to belong to the client herself. The page bears no date and no signature. It contains only a paragraph of writing, in a hand that grows slightly less steady as the paragraph proceeds, and that may have been composed in a single sitting on a quiet afternoon. The paragraph reads, more or less, as follows. It is not always sad. There are mornings when the kitchen is bright with the first light, and the wisteria is heavy on the porch outside, and I can hear the children running on the lawn, and I know everything I know, and I'm still not sad. There is something about knowing that makes the morning more its own. I'm not certain how to say this. The morning is no longer a morning that I am moving through on my way to something else. It is a morning. The wisteria is wisteria. The children are children. I am the woman drinking her coffee on the porch. I know what I know. The day will be what it is. I am here for it. The paragraph stops there. There is nothing else on the page. The brass clip holds it in place at the back of a file that runs to perhaps 300 pages and that documents a 5-year inquiry into the financial dealings of a man who was, the records strongly suggest, the writer's husband. The writer herself is identified in the body of the file only by her client code, but the handwriting on the brass-clipped sheet has been compared by a researcher with patience and access to the family's private papers with the handwriting of a particular woman who lived in a particular city and who maintained, throughout her long life, a tradition of writing small private reflections on slips of paper and tucking them into the book she was reading or the files she was keeping. The comparison is suggestive but not conclusive. We cannot, in the end, prove that the paragraph was written by this particular woman, but we can say, with reasonable confidence, that it was written by a woman of her circumstances and her temperament, and that it captures, in a paragraph, something that the rest of the records can only suggest by accumulation. The paragraph captures the strange equilibrium that some of these women eventually found. They began, in most cases, in a state of acute distress. They engaged the agency, they received the reports, they absorbed what they had learned, and then, in the long process that followed, they came to terms with the knowledge in ways that the dramatic narratives of betrayal and confrontation cannot capture. They did not, on the whole, achieve a state of forgiveness, because forgiveness was not always the appropriate response, and because it would, in any case, have required a transparency they could not afford. They achieved instead a state that the writer of the paragraph describes with unusual precision. The morning is no longer a morning that I am moving through on my way to something else. It is a morning. The wisteria is wisteria. The children are children. I know what I know. This is the deep emotional truth of these stories, and it is the truth that the broad summary always misses. The women who hired the agency were not destroyed by what they learned. They were not in many cases even particularly damaged. They were changed, certainly. They carried the knowledge for the rest of their lives. But the knowledge, far from poisoning their experience, seems to have settled, after a period of digestion, into a kind of grounding. The wisteria became more itself. The children became more themselves. The morning became a morning that the woman was in, rather than a morning that she was passing through on her way to a future she could not predict. This is a small wisdom, perhaps. It is not the wisdom of the great philosophers, or of the great religious traditions, or of the great political reformers. It is a domestic wisdom, a private wisdom, a wisdom that emerged from women's specific circumstances, and that may be, in important ways, untransferable to other circumstances. But it is, in its quiet way, a real wisdom, and it accounts for the strange peacefulness that one feels in the presence of these records, even when their substance is sad. The women who created them were not finely sad women. They had been sad often in particular moments. They had grieved often in the privacy of their own rooms, but they had also, in the longer term, found a way of inhabiting their lives that did not require them to be sad most of the time, and that allowed them, on many mornings, to drink their coffee on the porch with the wisteria heavy beside them, and the children running on the lawn, and to be, as the writer of the paragraph says, here for it. By the late autumn afternoons, in any of the great houses we have been imagining, the day begins to soften toward its end. The light through the tall windows takes on the long slanting quality of November, gold for an hour, and then suddenly gone, replaced by the grey hour and then by the early dark of the late year. The household, which has been busy through the morning with the work of the kitchen and the receiving of callers and the writing of letters and the supervising of the laundry, begins to slow. The maids retire to the back stairs for an hour of rest before the dinner preparations begin. The cook stands at the kitchen window and watches the early dark gathering in the small yard behind the house, and decides after a moment that she will allow herself a cup of tea before she begins the soup. The woman of the house, who has spent the late afternoon at her writing desk, completing a long letter to a sister or a cousin or an old school friend, places the pen back in its holder. She blots the final page. She folds the letter into thirds. She places it in an envelope of heavy cream paper. She addresses the envelope. She seals it with wax in the old fashion that her grandmother used, even though the wax is no longer strictly necessary and is, by the standards of 1905 or 1910, beginning to look slightly old-fashioned. She does not care. She likes the small red seal at the back of the envelope. It is a thing she has always done, and she does not see why she should stop doing it, because the world is changing in ways that she suspects are not improvements. She rises from the desk. She walks to the window. She looks out at the late afternoon, at the gas lamps that are just beginning to be lit along the avenue, at the figures of pedestrians walking quickly in the cold, at the bare branches of the trees moving in the wind. She thinks perhaps of the report she received last week from the agency, which she read once and then placed in the locked drawer of her writing desk, and has not since then returned to. She thinks, perhaps, of the report she will receive next week, which the operative will deliver in his usual envelope, and which she will read in this same room at this same desk, by the light of this same lamp, in this same posture of quiet attention. She thinks of all of this with a peculiar and not entirely unpleasant calm. The reports have become, over the years, part of the rhythm of her life. They are not any longer occasions for crisis. They are simply weekly reminders of what she already knows, with small new details added to the established picture. They are like the entries in a diary that she does not keep, but that someone else is keeping on her behalf. She reads them, she absorbs the new information, she returns them to the drawer, she continues with her day. She turns away from the window. She walks to the fireplace where the small coal fire that has been burning all afternoon has reduced itself to a glowing bed of embers. She kneels, with the careful movements of a woman who has not knelt in many years, and who does not trust her knees, and she takes the small brass tongs from the stand beside the fire, and she selects 3 lumps of coal from the scuttle, and she places them gently on the embers, one at a time so as not to scatter the heat. She rises, again with care, and she watches for a moment as the new coal catches and the flames lift slightly, and the room takes on, just perceptibly, the additional warmth. She leaves the writing room. She crosses the hall to the small parlour that overlooks the street, where she has been in the habit of taking her tea in the late afternoon, where no callers are expected. The parlour is dim. The maid has not yet drawn the curtains or lit the lamps. The light from the gas lamps on the avenue throws long, slanted shapes across the carpet, and the figures of the small porcelain birds on the mantelpiece are silhouetted against the windows like the shadows of real birds at twilight. She rings the small silver bell. The maid appears in the doorway. She asks for tea. She asks, in addition, for the curtains to be drawn and the lamps to be lit, and the maid moves through the room performing these tasks with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has performed them every afternoon for many years. When the maid has gone, the woman of the house sits in her chair near the fireplace. She's no longer young. She's no longer, in the strict sense, beautiful. She's a woman in her late 50s, perhaps, with the gathered features and the careful posture of a woman who has held her own household together through circumstances that the world will never know about. She drinks her tea slowly. She thinks about the dinner, which will be at 7, and at which a particular cousin is expected, with whom she will need to discuss a delicate matter concerning a niece. She thinks about her son, who is expected back from his trip to Cleveland tomorrow, and to whom she will need to speak about the small concern she's been carrying since his last visit. She thinks about her husband, who is at this moment in his study upstairs, working on something, and to whom she will say good evening at dinner with the particular small smile that she's been giving him for many years, and that he, in his oblivious way, accepts as her ordinary face. She thinks, also, of the operative. She does not know him personally. She's met him only twice, on the 2 occasions when the case required a direct consultation. She knows him principally through his handwriting, which she has come to recognise on the envelopes that arrive each Thursday, and through the small turns of phrase in his reports that have, over the years, become familiar to her. She does not, she would not claim to feel for him any of the emotions that the word friendship would imply. But she feels, when she thinks of him, the kind of slight warmth that one feels for any person who has been steadily present in one's life, in some narrow but reliable way, over a long period of time. She hopes he is well. She hopes his family is well. She hopes that, somewhere across the city in the offices of the agency, he is at this moment finishing his own work for the day and preparing to go home to whatever the rest of his life consists of, which she does not know and will never know. The tea grows cold in her cup. She does not, for the moment, ring for more. The fire crackles softly. The lamps throw their gentle yellow light across the room. The clock on the mantelpiece, which is a clock her father brought home from Paris in the 1860s, ticks with its familiar dry sound. Outside the curtained windows, the avenue grows darker. The pedestrians grow fewer. The carriages on the street move with the slower, more careful rhythm of evening traffic. The day is ending. The household is beginning the long, slow turn from afternoon into evening, and from evening eventually into night, and from night, in due course, into the morning that will follow, and that will be, in all its particulars, very much like every other morning of the long settled life she has built around herself, with its known sorrows and its known compensations and its known and reliable rhythms. There is a moment in any night in any house when the household crosses from active to passive, from waking to sleeping, from the noise of evening to the silence of night. The moment is small but distinct. It comes, in most great houses of the period, somewhere between 10:30 and 11:30, after the dinner has been cleared and the guests have departed, and the children have been settled for the night by the nurses, and the master and mistress of the house have completed their own small evening routines. The lamps on the lower floors have been turned down, the fires have been screened, the bolts on the front door have been thrown. The night watchman, if there is one, has begun his first round of the property, walking slowly through the dark rooms with a small lantern, checking the locks on the windows and the doors and pausing in each room for the careful inventory of his eyes. The mistress of the house, who has been the last of the family to retire, climbs the broad staircase to the second floor. She moves slowly. The stairs are dark, but she knows them. She's been climbing this particular staircase for so many years that her feet find the steps in any light. She holds her hand along the polished banister, which is cool to her touch. At the landing she pauses for a moment and looks down at the entrance hall, which is now entirely dark except for the small gas jet that is left burning, very low beside the front door in case of any emergency that might require quick light. The hall, in this dim glow, looks unfamiliar. The marble floor, which is a thing of beauty by day, looks at this hour like a long, pale stone. The portraits on the wall, which are her husband's grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and which she has never particularly cared for, are entirely invisible. She's alone in the house, in a way that she's never alone by day. She turns and continues up the second flight of stairs to her own floor. She enters her bedroom, which has been prepared for her by Yvette, or by whoever the equivalent of Yvette in her particular household is, with the bed turned down and the small night lamp lit and her dressing gown laid out on the chair beside the bed. The fire in the bedroom has been built up so that the room is warm without being stifling. The curtains are drawn against the night. The clock on the bedside table, which is a small French clock with a brass case, ticks softly. She prepares for bed. She removes her dress, which Yvette will find in the morning draped over the back of the chair, and will take downstairs to be pressed. She lets down her hair, which is long but no longer all dark, and brushes it for the count of 100 strokes, which is what her mother taught her to do when she was 12, and which she has continued to do every night for 40 years. She puts on her nightdress, which is white cotton, with a small lace trim, and her dressing gown, which is heavy silk in a dark blue colour that she favours. She walks to the small writing desk by the window, which is a different desk from the one in the writing room downstairs, and which she uses only for personal letters that she does not wish to write where the servants can see her writing them. She opens the small drawer. She removes a leather notebook. She opens the notebook to the next blank page. She picks up her pen. She writes, in the small, steady hand that she has used for these particular notes for many years, the date, and then a sentence or two of reflection on the day that has passed. She does not write at length. She writes only enough to settle the day in her own mind. She writes about a small thing the cook said at breakfast. She writes about a moment of unusual light through the parlour window in the afternoon. She writes about the cousin who came to dinner and about the dress she was wearing, which the woman of the house had thought was a particular kind of green, but which the cousin had called grey. She writes, in 2 sentences, about her husband, who had been unusually quiet at dinner and who had retired early. She writes nothing about the contents of the locked drawer in the writing desk downstairs. The notebook is not for that purpose. The notebook is for the surface of the day, the small visible particulars that, taken together, make a life recognisable to its own eyes. The contents of the locked drawer downstairs are for a different kind of record, kept in a different way, and not necessarily kept by her at all. She closes the notebook. She replaces it in the drawer. She closes the drawer. She rises from the desk. She walks to the bed. She turns down the lamp. She slides between the sheets, which are cool and smooth and smell faintly of the lavender that the laundry-maid puts in the linen press. She arranges the pillows. She lies on her side, facing the window, which is closed against the cold, but through which she can see, very faintly, the small movement of the curtains in the draught of the night. She closes her eyes. In the city, somewhere across the dark blocks of stone houses and lit avenues, an operative is also closing his day. He's in his small rooms in his boarding house. He has finished his notebook for the day. He has placed the notebook on the small table beside his bed. He has changed into his sleeping clothes. He has, before getting into bed, said the prayers that his mother taught him as a child in Glasgow, which he has continued to say every night for 40 years, even though he is not, by any formal definition, a religious man. He gets into bed. He turns down the lamp. He listens for a moment to the small sounds of the boarding house, the cough of a fellow lodger in the room next door, the creak of a floorboard in the hall, the distant whistle of a tug on the East River. He thinks briefly about the woman whose case he has been handling for the past 5 years. He hopes she is sleeping. He hopes, in a way that he would not be able to articulate even if he were asked, that she has found, in the long arrangement of their professional relationship, some small measure of the steadiness he has tried to provide. He closes his eyes. In an apartment in Murray Hill, the woman who has been the subject of so many of these reports is also closing her day. She's unmarried. She lives alone, except for a single servant who has a room at the back of the apartment. She's finished her own dinner, which was simple, and she has read for an hour in the small parlour, by the light of the lamp on the table beside her chair. She does not know that she is being watched. She has in fact never suspected in all the years that the watching has been going on that anyone outside her immediate circle has any particular knowledge of her existence. She has lived for many years in a careful private peace, supported by the quarterly payments and protected by the discretion of her arrangement, and she has built within the narrow limits of her circumstances a life that suits her. She closes her book. She rises from her chair. She walks to her own bedroom. She prepares for bed. She turns down her own lamp. She lies down on her own pillow. She closes her eyes. The man who's been visiting her on Thursday afternoons is, at this hour, also in bed, in the bedroom on the second floor of a house on Fifth Avenue, beside a sleeping wife who knows everything he believes she does not know. He has fallen asleep almost immediately in the way of men who do not, by temperament, lie awake. His breathing is slow and even. His hands rest on the counterpane. He is, in his own consciousness, untroubled. He has had a pleasant evening. He has dined well. He has spoken with intelligence and humour at his own dinner table, and his guests have departed with the kind of warmth that confirms a host in his sense of his own success. He is, in his own consciousness, a good husband, a good father, a good man. He does not know what his wife knows. He has never had reason to suspect that she knows it. He will go to his office in the morning, and he will conduct his usual business, and he will, on Thursday afternoon, walk the half-mile uptown to the apartment in Murray Hill, and he will spend his usual 2 hours there, and he will return, and his wife will greet him at dinner as if nothing has happened, and nothing, by his account, will have happened. He sleeps peacefully. His wife, beside him, breathes slowly in the dark, with her own thoughts gathering and dispersing in the quiet of the late hour. The whole long chain is asleep now, the mistress in the bedroom on the second floor, the operative in the boarding house in Chelsea, the woman in the apartment in Murray Hill, the master in his own bed beside his wife. The night watchman has finished his round. The lamp in the entrance hall burns its small low flame. The clock in the bedroom ticks very softly in the dark. Outside, the snow that began to fall in the early evening is continuing, slowly and without wind, settling on the rooftops and the cornices and the wrought iron of the front fence and the broad stone steps that lead up to the front door. The city, which is full of millions of people, is held together at this hour by the long sleep of all of those people, the rich and the poor, the watchers and the watched, the masters and the servants, the wives and the husbands, the mothers and the children, all of them held in the same dark, all of them breathing the same slow breath, all of them for a few hours equal in the simple fact of being unconscious. Picture the avenue at 3 a.m. The street is empty, the carriages have long since gone home, the single mounted policeman who patrols this section of Fifth Avenue passed by an hour ago and will not pass again for another 2 hours. The gas lamps burn their patient low flames, one to each block, casting small circles of yellow light onto the snow, which has continued to fall through the night, and which has, by this hour, covered the pavement in a soft layer that muffles every sound. The houses on either side of the avenue rise into the dark like ships in a fog, their windows entirely black except for the occasional small flicker of a night lamp behind a curtain in a sick room or a nursery. The wind has died. The snow falls straight down, slowly and steadily in flakes the size of small coins. The flakes catch the lamplight as they pass through it, and become, for a moment, small bright objects, and then disappear into the dark again, and then reappear, lower down, in the next circle of lamplight, and then disappear again into the snow on the pavement below. The trees along the curb, which were leafless and bare in the evening, have become, in the course of the night, white shapes that resemble the trees of a painting more than the trees of an actual avenue. The wrought iron fences in front of the houses have grown small white ridges along their upper edges. The carved stone steps that lead up to each front door have softened under the snow into the gentle rises of pale slopes. There is nothing happening on the avenue, no one is on the street, no vehicle is moving. The only sounds, if you were standing on the corner, would be the very faint hiss of the gas in the lamps and, somewhere far in the distance, the slow whistle of a train moving across the city on its long way to somewhere else. The night is profoundly quiet, in the particular way that snow makes a city quiet, which is unlike any other kind of quiet. The snow absorbs sound, and the absence of sound becomes itself a kind of presence, a soft, full silence that has weight, and that fills the spaces between the buildings, and that rests on the rooftops, and that drifts, slowly, down through the air with the falling flakes. Inside the houses, behind the dark windows, the sleeping continues. The bedrooms are warm, the fires that were built up in the late evening have burned down to embers but have not gone out, and they keep the rooms at a temperature that allows the sleepers to lie with the lighter blankets pulled up only to their shoulders. The servants on the upper floors, who sleep 4 to a room in the attics, are pressed close together in their narrow beds, and the warmth of their bodies fills the small rooms even in the absence of fire. The children in the nursery, who sleep 2 or 3 to a room with a nurse on a cot by the door, lie in their small forms with their breathing slow and even, and their hands curled against their pillows. The streets of the city below the great houses, where the small houses and the tenements of the working population stretch for miles in every direction, are also asleep, with the same slow, patient breathing. The watchmen on the docks have settled into their wooden shelters with their pipes and their newspapers. The men who tend the boilers in the basements of the office buildings have for the most part fallen asleep at their stations, and will wake themselves in time to stoke the fires before the morning shift arrives. The horses in the stables have shifted in their stalls and have settled again into the dim half-sleep of stabled animals, with their heads lowered and their breath making small clouds in the cold air of the stable. The city is held by the night. The buildings, which by day are the loud and busy stages of so much commerce, and so much striving and so much careful management of appearances, have become, in this hour, simply structures of stone and brick standing in a slow snowfall. The differences between the houses, which by day are so insistent and so important, have softened. From the street, in the lamplight, the great Fifth Avenue mansion and the modest brownstone 3 blocks east look not so very different. They are both dark, they are both quiet. They are both, in this hour, simply human shelters holding their share of sleeping bodies through the long winter night. This is the thing that the records in the end are most about. They are about people, sleeping. They are about the slow accumulation of a life, day by day and night by night, through the long routines of waking and working and watching and not watching, and turning down the lamp and going to bed. They are about the small private decisions that women made, in writing rooms by the light of single lamps, to know what they knew, and to act on what they knew in ways that did not disturb the sleep of the households they had built. They are about the patience of the operatives who walked the streets in their plain coats, and who watched, and who wrote in their notebooks, and who slept in their own boarding-house beds with the satisfaction of work carefully done. They are about the long, quiet, braided thread of human attention that connects, across the dark of the city, the woman in the great house on Fifth Avenue with the operative in Chelsea, with the woman in Murray Hill with the man who moves, unaware between them. The snow keeps falling, the lamps keep burning, the houses keep their warmth, the sleepers keep their slow breath. The night, which is long, gradually turns toward morning. The sky to the east, which has been entirely black since 7 o'clock the previous evening, begins, somewhere around 5:30, to show the very first softening of the dark. It is not yet morning. It is the hour before morning, when the sky is no longer fully night, but is not yet, in any visible way, day. The lamplighter, who walks his rounds at 6, has not yet begun. The kitchens, where the cooks rise at 6:30, are still entirely dark. The streets, where the milkmen begin their deliveries at 7, are still empty. The city is held for 1 more hour in the deep silence of the late night, and the snow continues, and the sleepers continue, and the long, careful pattern of the human world rests, for 1 more hour, in the patient hands of the dark. When the morning eventually comes, it comes very slowly. The sky lightens from black to a deep blue to a paler blue to the soft grey that means the snow has stopped and the clouds are beginning to thin. The lamplighter walks his rounds, turning out the gas lamps one by one along the avenue, and the small circles of yellow light on the snow disappear, one by one, replaced by the larger uniform light of the early morning sky. The first delivery wagons appear on the side streets, their wheels making a low crunching sound on the new snow. The first servants emerge from the back doors of the great houses with brooms and shovels to clear the front walks before the families are awake. The smoke begins to rise from the chimneys as the kitchens are lit and the kettles are put on, and the long routine of the morning begins to assemble itself. In the great house on Fifth Avenue, the cook is at her station before 7. She has lit the fire in the range, she has put on the kettle, she has begun to set out the ingredients for the morning's bread, and the morning's coffee and the morning's eggs. She works in the warm yellow light of the kitchen lamps, with the steady, careful movements of a woman who has performed these tasks every morning for many years, and who can perform them while half her mind is somewhere else. She thinks this morning about her own daughter who has written from upstate that the baby is teething and not sleeping, and she thinks about her own grandmother, who used to put a piece of clove on the gum of a teething child, and she resolves to write a letter to her daughter this afternoon with this small piece of folk wisdom that she has not thought of in many years. The housemaids, who rose at 6:15, are moving quietly through the lower rooms. They are pulling back the curtains, they are sweeping the hearths, they are removing the screens from the fireplaces and replacing them with fresh fires laid on clean coal. They are setting out the breakfast things in the breakfast room, with the white linen tablecloth and the silver and the small flowers in the small vase. They work in pairs, mostly without speaking, with the kind of practiced coordination that comes from long shared work. They have known one another for years, they know one another's families, they know one another's small troubles and small triumphs. They do not, on the whole, discuss the family they serve. They have learned from their own experience and from the example of older servants that the family is to be served rather than discussed, and that the small details of the family's life that they cannot help observing are best kept among themselves and never carried beyond the back stairs. Upstairs, the mistress of the house has been wakeful for some time. She has lain in the dark listening to the house come back to life around her, with the calm attention of a woman who has slept reasonably well and who is in no hurry to begin her day. She has watched the line of light around the curtains grow from a thin grey to a paler grey. She has heard, very faintly, the sound of the maid moving in the dressing room across the hall, laying out the morning dress. She has thought, in the slow way that one thinks in the hour before rising, about the day ahead and about the small obligations that will fill it. She has thought about the cousin who is coming to lunch and about the letter she will write to her older sister this afternoon. She's thought briefly about the report from the agency that will arrive on Thursday, and she's thought about it without any particular emotion, simply as another part of the rhythm of her week. She's thought finally about the wisteria on the porch at the country house, which will be coming into bloom in the spring, and which she is already looking forward to in the unhurried way that one looks forward to the predictable annual returns of beauty. She rises. She walks to the window. She pulls back one corner of the curtain and looks out at the avenue. The snow is fresh and bright, untrodden in many places, with only the small tracks of the early delivery wagons and the cleared paths in front of the houses. The morning light, now that the clouds have thinned, is striking the snow at a low angle and turning it, in places, almost gold. She watches for a moment. A small boy in a heavy coat walks along the opposite sidewalk, kicking his way through the deeper snow at the curb. A horse-drawn delivery wagon turns the corner from a side street and moves slowly up the avenue, leaving a clean, dark line behind it on the snow. The day is beginning. The world is gathering itself together for whatever will happen in the hours ahead, and she will, in due course, gather herself together to be part of it. She turns from the window. She rings for the maid. The maid enters with the warm water for washing and the prepared morning dress. The day begins. The mistress of the house is, once again, the mistress of the house, performing the small acts of dressing and of speaking to her staff and of preparing herself for whatever the morning will bring. She does this with the same calm she has felt for many years, with the steady, reliable presence that her household and her family have learned to depend on, and she does it in the knowledge, held quietly in the back of her mind, that whatever this day brings she will know how to handle it, because she has been handling things in her own quiet way for a long time. and she has, by now, the kind of practice that no school could have given her, and that no manual could have taught her, but that the long, slow work of her actual life has, by patient accumulation, made entirely her own. For every woman whose case made its way into the archives of the Pinkerton Agency, there were many more whose attentions to the troubles of their households never took the form of a hired engagement at all. The records, when one reads them carefully, are surprisingly clear about this. The Pinkertons did extensive work for wealthy families, but the wealthy families themselves represented only a small fraction of the country, and even among those families, only a particular subset ever crossed the threshold of an agency office. The rest, which is to say the great majority, handled their concerns by their own quieter methods, methods which left no paper trail, and which the historian, looking back across the long distance, can only infer rather than read. Consider, for a moment, the woman who simply knew, without needing to hire anyone, what was happening in her own house. She had her own staff, after all, and her staff had eyes, and her staff had loyalties that, over the long years of shared service, had often deepened into something that was very near to family feeling. The housekeeper who had been in the household for 30 years, the lady's maid who had dressed her mistress every morning since the mistress was a young bride, the butler who had served at every dinner and who knew, without being told, which guests at which dinners had taken too much wine and had said too much. These people were a kind of intelligence service of their own, and a clever mistress knew how to make use of them without ever appearing to do so. It was not, as a rule, a matter of direct questions. A wife did not ask her butler what her husband had been doing in the afternoons. Such a question would have crossed a line that both the wife and the butler understood was not to be crossed, and both of them would have felt the indignity of it. The arrangement was more delicate than that. The butler, in the course of his work, observed many things, and a small share of what he observed, the share that he judged to be of legitimate interest to the mistress, found its way to her by indirect means through the housekeeper, who was the official channel of communication between the staff and the lady of the house. The housekeeper, in her morning meetings with the mistress, would mention, in the natural course of reviewing the small affairs of the household, that the master had taken his hat and his coat at 3 on Thursday, and had returned at 5 1/4, and that this was, she happened to notice, the 3rd Thursday in succession on which this had occurred. The mistress would receive this information without comment, would nod, would move on to the question of the menus for the week, and the housekeeper would understand that her communication had been received and that she should continue to mention these particulars in the same matter-of-fact way in subsequent meetings. This was an intelligence operation of its own, conducted entirely within the household, without external assistance and without any formal contract. The information that flowed through it was not as detailed as the reports that the Pinkertons produced. It did not include the address of the apartment in Murray Hill or the description of the woman who lived there, but it was enough, often enough, to confirm what the mistress already suspected, and confirmation was, for many women, all that was needed. They did not require the full forensic accounting of a Pinkerton report. They required only enough certainty to make their own decisions, and the household staff, watching with the same attention as any operative but without any of the operative's training, provided that certainty in the gentle indirect language of long service. There were, beyond the staff, other channels of information. The wives of one's friends who saw one's husband at parties, and who watched whom he stood beside and how long he stayed, and whom he spoke to as he was leaving. The dressmaker, who served many households, and who heard, in the course of her fittings, the small confidences of many women, and who could be persuaded by a sufficiently warm and trusting mistress to share, in the most discreet way, the small pieces of knowledge that she had gathered. The hairdresser, who was an even more intimate confidant than the dressmaker, and whose long sessions with her clients produced conversations of a depth that the husbands would have been astonished to know about. The doctor, who knew the small medical particulars of every member of the household, and who could, with proper questions from a worried wife, indicate, without violating his oath, whether there were certain matters that might warrant her attention. These were the unofficial detectives of every wealthy household. They did not call themselves detectives. They were not paid for their detection. They did not produce reports or testify in court. But they were everywhere, watching everything, and they reported, when they reported, to women who had the patience and the social skill to elicit what they knew without forcing them to say it directly. The Pinkertons, then, represented only the formal end of a much longer and more various practice. They were the part that left records, The rest of it, the much larger part of it, the daily work of attention that wives and mothers and sisters performed in every household where there was anything worth watching, has left almost no records at all. We must imagine it. We must infer it from the small mentions in letters, from the offhand remarks in memoirs, from the careful way that women of that period spoke about the management of their households when they spoke about it at all. We must imagine the woman in the morning room, hearing from her housekeeper the small report of the day's observations, and we must imagine her receiving the report without expression, with the same calm she received the report on the linen inventory or the menu for the week, and we must understand that the calm itself was the skill, that the ability to hear what one needed to hear without showing that one had heard it, was the central technique of the whole long, quiet practice. The historians who study this period, when they consider the question at all, sometimes call this practice domestic surveillance. The phrase is technically accurate, but does not capture the texture of the thing. It was not in most cases hostile. It was not in most cases undertaken with any intention of confrontation or punishment. It was undertaken because the woman who ran a great house needed to know what was happening in it. She needed to know in order to do her job. Her job was the management of the household, which included, by long tradition and by practical necessity, the management of the emotional and social atmosphere of the household, the maintenance of the appearances by which the household presented itself to the world, the preservation of the reputations on which the household's standing depended. She could not perform her job in ignorance. Ignorance, for the mistress of a great house, was a luxury she could not afford, so she watched, she listened. She received the small reports that flowed to her from her staff, and from her friends, and from her dressmaker and her doctor, and the wives of her acquaintances. And she acted on what she learned, in her own quiet way, without confrontation and without scandal, and the household continued day after day and year after year, in the calm, productive rhythm that her watchful management made possible. Picture the long generation of such women, each of them in her own house, each of them with her own staff and her own friends and her own particular sources of information, each of them performing this work without any awareness that other women in other houses were performing exactly the same work, each of them feeling, perhaps, that her own watchfulness was something private and particular to herself. The truth is that she was part of a vast informal sisterhood, an unspoken collective practice that linked the wives and the mothers and the sisters of every great household in every city, and that had been going on for generations, and that would go on for generations after she was gone. The records that we do have, the Pinkerton archives and the law firm files and the occasional letters that survived, are the visible peak of this submerged mountain. Most of the mountain remains underwater. Most of the careful watching that women did in their own households remains invisible to the historian. We know it happened only because the small surviving pieces of evidence, taken together, suggest the shape of something much larger than the evidence itself can fully describe. The shape is that of a long, quiet practice of attention conducted by women in their own homes, with their own staff and their own social networks, for their own purposes, generation after generation, without fanfare, without confrontation, without leaving, in most cases, any trace at all. When the contemporary observer looked into one of the great houses of the period, and saw a wife sitting quietly in her morning room, while her husband attended to his business, and her children played in the nursery, and her servants moved about their tasks, the observer saw, on the surface, a picture of decorative domestic peace. The observer did not see what was actually happening. What was actually happening was the patient gathering and processing of information that, in any other context, would have been recognized as the work of a careful executive. The morning room was, in fact, a kind of operation center. The housekeeper's report was, in fact, a kind of briefing. The dressmaker's confidences were, in fact, a kind of intelligence stream. The wife's calm reception of these various inputs was, in fact, the calm of a manager who is accustomed to processing complex and sometimes troubling information, and who has learned, through long practice, not to let her reactions show on her face. The decorative domestic piece was, in fact, the visible surface of a continuous low-level operation of household management that included a substantial component of what would today be called surveillance and intelligence gathering, and that was performed by the wife, in plain sight, every day of her married life, without ever being identified, even by herself, as the serious and skilled work that it actually was. The Pinkertons, when they were hired at all, were hired by women who needed something more than what their household and their social network could provide. They needed evidence that would stand up in a courtroom, or they needed a level of investigation that their household staff was not equipped to perform, or they needed information about a person who was not part of their household or their social circle. For these specific tasks, the agency was a useful resource, but the agency did not replace the wife's own intelligence work. It supplemented it. The wife continued to gather information through her own channels, in her own house, as she always had. The Pinkertons added, when needed, the extra layer of formal external investigation that the situation required. The two together produced the most thorough picture available, but the household-based intelligence work was the foundation, and the agency work was the addition, and the wife, who was the master of both, was the central intelligence of the entire operation. This is, I think, the most important thing to understand about the women whose stories these archives partially preserve. They were not amateurs who occasionally and exceptionally turned to professional help. They were skilled and experienced managers of information who, when they engaged professional help, knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. They were not novices in the world of careful attention. They were veterans, and the Pinkerton records, when we read them, show this clearly. The instructions are precise. The questions are specific. The women who hired the agency knew what they wanted to know, and they knew how to ask for it, and they knew how to use the answers when they got them. This is not the work of women who are stumbling into something new. This is the work of women who had been managing this kind of attention, in less formal ways, for years before they ever set foot in an agency office. Picture then the long line of such women, stretching back through the generations of every great household in every city, each of them maintaining her own quiet practice of attention, each of them passing on the practice to her daughter, and her daughter-in-law and her younger sister, each of them building without any formal recognition of what she was building, the skills and the habits that would allow her, when the occasion arose, to handle her own most difficult situations with the calm efficiency that the Pinkerton records show us. The Pinkerton records, in the end, are not the beginning of this story. They are the middle of it. The beginning is much older and much quieter, and we will never read it in any archive, because it was conducted in morning rooms and parlours and private writing desks, by women who knew that the most important part of their work was the part that no one could see. The records, for the most part, end. The years pass, the cases close, one after another, sometimes with a resolution, and sometimes only with the gradual fading of the matter into the background of a long life. The men who were watched continued, in most cases, to live their lives without ever knowing they had been watched, and the women who had hired the watching continued, in most cases, to live their lives without ever finding it necessary to confront what they had learned. The information, having been gathered, was used in the quiet ways that information of that kind was used, and the lives of the households continued, and the seasons turned, and the years accumulated, and the women who had once stood at the centre of these careful operations gradually moved into the long afterward of their own lives. Picture Adelaide, the woman with whom this story began in the year 1908. She is no longer young. Her hair, which was dark brown when she first walked into the Pinkerton office in the early afternoon of a Tuesday many years before, is now entirely white. She wears it the way the women of her generation wore their white hair, gathered up in a soft, loose arrangement at the back of her head, held in place with the small tortoise-shell combs that her mother had given her when she was first married. Her face has the lines that a long life leaves on a face that has known both pleasure and care. Her hands are thinner than they once were, and the rings she has worn for many years have grown a little loose on her fingers, so that she has had them resized by the same jeweller her mother used to fit her present hands. She lives still in the same house on Fifth Avenue, although the avenue itself has changed around her, with motor cars now appearing on the streets where once only carriages and saddle horses moved, and with the houses next to her own having been variously enlarged and rebuilt and repainted in the changing fashions of the new century. Her husband died in 1901. He died, as such men often do, of a heart that had been weakened by many years of good dinners and rich wine, and the kind of work that consists primarily of meetings in close rooms. He died at home, in the bedroom on the second floor with the doctor in attendance, and with Adelaide sitting beside him in the chair where she had sat beside him through several earlier illnesses. He died, in the end, quite peacefully, with the small smile that some dying men have when they have come to terms with their dying, and Adelaide held his hand through the last hour and was, in spite of everything, genuinely sorry to see him go. He had been her husband for many years. He had been the father of her children. He had been, in his own confused way, a person she had loved, and the love, although it had become complicated and had been tested by knowledge that he never knew she possessed, had never entirely disappeared. She wept for him. She buried him in the family plot. She wore the black of mourning for the proper number of months, and she came out of mourning with the grave dignified composure that the women of her generation considered correct. She did not, in the weeks after his death, ever consider revealing to anyone what she had known throughout the years of their marriage. The information died with him. The reports that had accumulated in the locked drawer of the writing desk were, in the first week of her widowhood, removed by her own hand and burned in the fireplace of the writing room, one report at a time, with the small, careful movements of a woman who is performing a final act of discretion. She watched the papers blacken and curl and fall to ash, and when the last report was burned, she closed the door of the firebox and rang for the maid to clean the hearth, and the matter was, by her own decision, ended. The woman in the apartment in Murray Hill, who had been the subject of so many of those reports, lived on for several years after Adelaide's husband died. She did not, of course, attend the funeral. She would not have been welcome, and she would not have presumed. But she sent through a discreet intermediary a small note of condolence to Adelaide, the note written in a hand that Adelaide had never seen, but that she recognised immediately for what it was. The note was simple. It expressed in a few careful sentences the regret that the writer felt at the loss, and it offered, with great delicacy, the assurance that the writer had always understood the limits of her own position and had never wished to give pain. Adelaide read the note twice. She did not reply. She placed the note in the drawer where the reports had been kept, and several days later she removed it again, and burned it with the same care she had used on the reports. The Murray Hill woman, having sent her note, did not communicate further. She lived on quietly for some years. Eventually, Adelaide learned, through the same discreet channels that had brought her information for so many years, that the woman had died. The funeral was small. There were no Vanderbilts or Astors or Fifth Avenue families present. Adelaide read the brief notice in the newspaper, and folded the newspaper closed and set it aside and went on with her mourning. The matter was complete. In her widowhood, Adelaide did the work that widows of her class were expected to do. She continued to manage the household, although the household was now smaller, since the children were grown and had houses of their own. She continued to entertain, on a reduced scale, the friends and the relations who formed her circle. She continued to oversee the country house, where she now spent more of her time, walking each afternoon in the gardens that her husband had laid out 20 years earlier, and that the gardener now maintained for her with the same patient skill he had brought to the work when her husband was alive. She continued to read, to write letters, to attend the small civic and charitable obligations that women of her position attended. She continued, in all the visible ways, to be the same Adelaide she had been throughout her married life. But there was, in her widowhood, a new quality to her presence. The watchfulness that had been part of her for so long had not disappeared, but it had softened. There was no longer anything in particular to watch. Her husband was gone. The Murray Hill arrangement was over. Her children were grown and were managing their own households in their own ways, and although she observed them with the same attention she had always given to the people around her, she did not feel that her observation needed to result in any particular action. She watched simply because watching was what she did, because the habit of attention had become, after so many years, part of who she was. But the watching was no longer in service of any specific purpose. It was simply the quiet alertness of a long life, taking in what passed before it, holding it for a moment in the calm mind that had been trained to hold so much. She went sometimes to visit the office that had once handled her case. The Pinkerton agency still existed. The offices had moved several times in the course of the years. The original building she had first walked into had been pulled down and replaced. But the agency continued, and Mr. Reston, who had been her first contact there, had long since retired but was still living in a small house in Brooklyn, where Adelaide called on him once or twice a year in the long quiet afternoons of her widowhood. They sat in his parlour. They drank tea. They did not, on the whole, discuss the old cases. They discussed the small particulars of his present life, his grandchildren, his garden, his small books and his small interests. They discussed the changes in the city, the disappearance of the old houses, the rise of the new buildings, the noise of the motor cars on the streets. They did not need to discuss the old work. The work was finished on both sides. What remained between them was something gentler than the work, something that was very near to friendship, although neither of them would have used that word, and that had grown out of the long, careful collaboration of their professional years, and that had, in the quiet of their respective retirements, become a small, steady thing that they both, in their own ways, valued. Mr. Reston died in 1910. He was an old man by then, well into his 80s, and his death was peaceful and was not a surprise. Adelaide attended the small funeral, which was held at a Presbyterian church in Brooklyn, and she sat at the back, dressed in black, and she watched the modest gathering of family and friends pay their respects to a man whose work had touched many lives, and whose work had been known, in any detailed way, to almost none of the people who were now standing in the small church. She stayed only briefly after the service. She did not introduce herself to the family. She returned to her own house in Manhattan in the early evening, and she sat in her writing room and looked out the window for a long time, watching the light fade over the avenue, and she thought about Mr. Reston, and about the long quiet shape of their collaboration, and she did not write anything in her notebook that night. Some things she had learned were better not written. Adelaide lived on for several more years. She was, in her last years, frail but lucid, surrounded by her children and her grandchildren, attended by a maid who'd been with her for decades, and who was now nearly as old as Adelaide herself. She read less. She walked less. She slept more. The visits she made to the country house grew shorter. The dinners she gave grew smaller. But she remained, until the very end herself, the same calm, watchful Adelaide who had walked into the Pinkerton office on that Tuesday afternoon so many years before, the same Adelaide who had read the reports and burned them and kept the long peace of her household, the same Adelaide who had learned, over the long course of her life, that the most important things were the things one did not say, the things one did not write, the things one held quietly in one's own mind and acted on, when one acted, with the lightest possible touch. She died in 1915 in the bedroom on the second floor of the house on Fifth Avenue, in the same bed where her husband had died 14 years before, attended by her own daughter, who held her hand through the last hour with the same steady attention that Adelaide had brought to the last hour of her husband's life. Her death was reported, in a small notice in the morning paper, in the manner that the deaths of women of her class were reported, with a brief mention of her family connections and her charitable activities and her long marriage. There was no mention of the Pinkerton case. There was no mention of the woman in Murray Hill. There was no mention of the watchfulness that had shaped so much of her adult life. The notice gave only the surface of her life, the surface that she had so carefully maintained throughout her years, and the deeper layers, the careful work of attention that had occupied so much of her mind and her energy, went with her into the silence where they had always in the end belonged. What the women left behind is harder to name than what they did. The hiring of the agency was a single act, or sometimes a series of acts, taking place across a span of months or years, and resulting in the production of a certain number of reports, and the payment of a certain number of fees, and the gradual closing of a certain number of files. The act was specific, definite, recorded. But what came after the act, what the women carried with them into the rest of their lives, what they passed on without ever quite naming it, to the daughters and the daughters-in-law and the younger sisters who would later face their own situations, was something else, something that resists the kind of clean description that the files in the archives offer. It was perhaps a posture toward the world, a way of holding oneself in the presence of difficult information, a practiced calm, a learned patience, the understanding that the worst thing one could do with painful knowledge was to react to it immediately, in front of others, in a way that could not be taken back. The understanding that there was almost always time to think, to consider, to choose carefully what one would do with what one had learned. The understanding that the people who acted in haste tended to make their situations worse, and the people who held their counsel tended to find that the situations, with patience, often resolved themselves, or revealed themselves to be different from what they had first appeared, or simply became, in time, things one had learned to live with. The daughters watched their mothers. They did not always know what they were watching. They saw their mothers in the morning rooms conducting their quiet business. They saw their mothers receive the various small reports of their households with composed expressions. They saw their mothers move through the small social difficulties of their lives without ever appearing to be ruffled. They saw their mothers, when difficult news came, sit quietly for a time and then take up their work again with the same steady attention they had always given it. The daughters absorbed, without being taught, the lesson that this was how a competent woman handled her life. The lesson was passed down by example, not by instruction. The mothers did not say, "When you are grown, you will need to know how to receive difficult information without showing it." The mothers simply lived this way, day after day and year after year, and the daughters, watching, learned. Some of the daughters, when they were grown, would face their own moments of needing to know something they were not sure they wanted to know. Some of them would hire their own agencies. Some of them would simply listen, in the way their mothers had listened, to the small reports that flowed through their own households. Some of them would never face anything that required this kind of attention, and would live out their lives in households where there was nothing in particular to watch, and would not even fully realize what they had been prepared for. But the preparation would be there in any case, lying in the deep layers of their character where their mother's example had placed it, ready to be drawn upon if the need ever arose. This is, in the end, perhaps the most important of the inheritances that these women passed down. Not the houses, although the houses passed down too, with their furniture and their portraits and their small domestic histories. Not the money, although the money passed down too into the trusts and the inheritances and the carefully managed distributions that supported the next generation. But the example of a way of being, the example of attention without anxiety, the example of knowledge without confrontation, the example of the long calm that came from understanding that one had the tools, in oneself, to handle whatever came, because one had been trained, by long observation of one's own mother, in the careful patient art of managing a life. The records do not show this. The records show only the cases and the reports and the payments. They show only the visible surface. The deeper inheritance, the example that passed from mother to daughter, through the silent transmission of daily presence, the practiced calm that became, in the next generation, a habit so deep that it was hardly recognized as a habit at all. None of this appears in the files. It cannot appear in the files. It is too large and too slow and too quiet for any file to hold. It is part of the long underground river of women's experience that flows beneath all the visible records of any period, providing the steady current that the visible records float on without ever quite acknowledging. Picture, then, the last small image of this long story. A Fifth Avenue townhouse on a late winter evening, many years after the events of the original case. The avenue is quiet. The snow that fell earlier in the day has stopped, and the air is still and cold. The lamps along the street burn their patient flames in the dark. Inside the townhouse, the rooms are warm and quiet. The fires in the downstairs rooms have burned down to embers. The clock in the hall ticks softly. The portraits on the walls, which were once portraits of grandfathers and great-grandfathers, are now also portraits of a mother and a father whose generation has passed, and who watch over the present house from the same walls where they used to watch over the houses of their own time. The mistress of the house is a younger woman now. She's the granddaughter of Adelaide, although she did not know Adelaide well and remembers her only as a soft old voice and a steady hand resting on her own small hand in some long-ago afternoon. She sits in her writing room. She's alone. Her husband is at his club and will not return until late. Her children are asleep upstairs, attended by their nurse. The servants are mostly retired for the night, except for the night footman, who is dozing quietly in the entrance hall as is his custom. She has finished her evening reading. She has poured herself a small glass of warm milk, which she takes at this hour for the help it gives her with sleep, and she's sitting with the glass in her hand looking at the lamp on the desk, thinking about the small business of her day. She has received that afternoon a small piece of information that has given her some thought. The information is not, she suspects, of any great consequence. It concerns a small inconsistency in her husband's account of where he was on a certain Tuesday afternoon last week. The inconsistency may be nothing. It is the kind of thing that her grandmother, she thinks, would have recognized and would have known how to handle. She does not, at this point, know what she will do. She does not need to know tonight. The matter is not urgent. The matter can wait. She will sleep on it, and in the morning she will think about it again, and she will, in due course, decide whether anything needs to be done. For now, it is enough to have received the information and to have held it in her mind and to have noticed what it might mean. She finishes her milk. She rises from her chair. She turns off the lamp on the writing desk. She walks through the dark rooms of the lower floor with the small flame of the entrance hall lamp visible at the far end of the hallway. She climbs the stairs, holding the banister, in the way her grandmother once climbed these same stairs. She enters her bedroom. She prepares for bed. She lies down between the cool sheets. She closes her eyes. The house is quiet. The avenue is quiet. The snow on the rooftops is quiet. The portraits on the walls watch over the sleeping rooms with the same patient attention they have given the rooms for many generations. The clock in the hall ticks softly. The night footman in the entrance hall sleeps in his chair. The single small flame of the gas lamp by the front door burns its low, careful flame, ready to be turned up if needed, content to be turned low while everyone sleeps. Somewhere across the city, in a small apartment whose location no one in this house has any reason to know, another life is also coming to its quiet end of the day, attended by no observer, requiring no report, simply existing in the way that lives exist when no one is looking. And somewhere else in the city, in a small set of offices that has changed buildings several times since Adelaide first walked through its door, the records of many old cases sit in the slow dust of their long shelves, watched only by the cleaning woman who passes through the rooms in the early morning, who does not read what is on the papers and would not understand them if she did, and who keeps the offices, by her careful labour, in the condition that the agency requires. The long pattern continues. The watching continues, although it has changed its forms. The watched continue, although they do not know they are watched. The records accumulate in their archives, the slow paper accretion of a long century of careful attention. The mothers continue to teach their daughters by example the small steady arts of the difficult life. The houses continue to stand on their avenues, holding their families through their long generations. The snow continues to fall in its appropriate seasons on the rooftops and the lamps and the quiet sleeping streets. The world, with all its visible activity and all its invisible undercurrents, continues in its long way, indifferent to who is observing and who is observed, providing the steady stage on which all of these small private dramas are quietly enacted, night after night and year after year and generation after generation, in the calm, patient unfolding of time. The lamp by the front door burns low. The portraits watch over the sleeping rooms. The clock ticks softly in the dark hall. The mistress of the house, in her bed on the second floor, breathes slowly and evenly in her sleep. The information she received this afternoon waits, patiently, in the back of her mind to be considered again in the morning. The house holds its long quiet through the dark hours. And somewhere, in a churchyard far away, the woman who first walked into the Pinkerton office on a Tuesday afternoon many years ago rests in her own long sleep, beside the husband she loved and watched in equal measure, beneath the slow, patient turning of the same sky that watches over all of us, eventually in the end. Picture, for one last unhurried moment, the long shape of this story. Picture the women in their writing rooms across many decades, each of them in the small circle of lamplight, each of them holding her quiet authority over her own household, each of them deciding in her own time and in her own way what she would do with what she had learned. Picture the operatives in their plain coats, walking through the changing streets of changing cities, taking their patient notes, returning to their boarding houses to write up the day's small observations. Picture the long shelves of records that accumulated year after year in the back rooms of unmarked offices, the slow paper testament of all that careful work, most of it never to be read by anyone after the case was closed, all of it preserved nonetheless in the patient archives of an institution that understood by long habit that the records of human lives deserve to be kept even when no one is looking for them anymore. Picture the wisteria on the porch at the country house, which has bloomed every spring for many years, and which will bloom again this coming spring, and the spring after that, and the spring after that, regardless of who is there to see it, and regardless of which family is sitting on the porch to watch it bloom. Picture the long summer afternoons at Newport and at Bar Harbour, and at the other summer places where these women spent their summers, the slow rhythm of the days, the warmth of the sun on the verandas, the small clinking of teacups in the afternoons, the gentle drift of conversation across the long shaded porches. Picture the winter evenings in the city, the snow falling slowly past the gas lamps, the warm rooms behind the heavy curtains, the families gathered in the drawing rooms with their books and their needlework and their quiet talk. Picture all of it, The entire long, peaceful surface of these women's lives, the surface that they worked so carefully to maintain, the surface that was, in its way, an achievement as real as any that the men of their period accomplished in their offices and their boardrooms. Picture too the small private moments that no record could ever hold. The mother who looked across a breakfast table at the husband she'd been watching for months and felt, despite everything, a tenderness for him that did not lessen because of what she knew. The sister who received word from her brother that he had finally agreed, after the long, careful arrangements, to enter the country sanatorium, and who sat alone in her writing room with the letter open in front of her and quietly wept, not from any particular sorrow, but from the simple relief of a long worry finally easing. The daughter who walked through the cool early evening of Paris with her mother on her arm and felt, without being told, that something difficult had been handled by her mother in a way that had spared the family from harm. These moments, the small interior moments that came after the work was done, were the real reward of the long patient attention these women had paid to their lives. The reports had served their purpose. The reports could now be burned. What remained was a household held together, a family preserved, a daughter protected, a sister cared for, a brother helped. The work in the end had been worth doing. The silence with which it had been done had been the price, and the women who paid that price had paid it willingly, because they understood, in the long deep way that women of their kind understood things, that some kinds of work are best done quietly, and that some kinds of victories are best kept entirely to oneself. And picture, finally, the long sleep that comes for all of us. Eventually, in our turn, the patient kindly dark that holds the rich and the poor and the watchers and the watched and the famous and the forgotten in the same gentle equality of rest. The women whose stories these archives partially preserve have all gone into that long sleep now. The operatives who served them have gone there too. The houses they lived in are mostly torn down, replaced by buildings whose inhabitants have no memory of who once walked their floors. The papers are in their archives, the lamps are out, the snow continues to fall, in its appropriate seasons, on the rooftops and the streets, and the patient stone that marks the resting places of these long-ago lives. And the night, which is the deepest gift the world has to give to anyone who is tired, settles softly over all of them, and over us, and over the long, quiet inheritance of the work they did and the silence they kept and the small, careful ways they made their lives, in a difficult time, their own. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and